The engine of your vehicle is one of the most expensive components. The sad part is, even with good maintenance, many engines are just doomed for catastrophic failure as little as 60,000 miles. Poor designed engines will cost you hard-earned money and time at the dealership. But I'm going to share a list of all of the major engines, the different sizes, from turbocharged 4-cylinder engines, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engines, 6-cylinder engines, V8 engines, V10s, and even 3-cylinder engines as well. So you can go out armed with the information to avoid the worst engines on the market, many of which won't even last 50 or 60,000 miles. So sit back, it's a long haul, grab your popcorn, your favorite drink. Let's get into it now. Let's start with one of the most popular engine types, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine. Like this Toyota, for example, they utilize this 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine and they continue to use it over and over. Also in many Lexus as well as Toyota products because it's reliable. This is not one of the most problematic vehicles. Unfortunately, many other car manufacturers forget how to build a reliable engine like Toyota. Let's get into the list of some of the absolute worst, most devastating, poorly built 4-cylinder engines on the market. Now the next car is this little cutie right behind me here. And could you imagine if they made it electrified? That would take all the mechanical issues out of the equation here. But these are popular little cars, all the way from Mr. Bean. These go way back. They even have a little bit of a racing heritage, and they're exciting to look at and even more so to drive. The problem is what's under the hood. But let's take a look. Look at this. How's that for a gap? 2 fingers there? But the other side, I can't. So clearly there's an issue in build quality and consistency there. Here we have this great little front grille. And this is a Cooper S right here. Has great little fog lights on the front. And the bug eyes do look impressive from a distance. Of course, they've got that front hood scoop, looks sharp. And this front spoiler here definitely has a sporting look to it. And even from the side. Oops! You think that little accident maybe had something to do with the alignment on the headlights? Just saying is all. But then they have these great little mirrors. Love these high gloss black mirrors. What about this large glass panel on the roof? Beautiful. And then you've got this wonderful overhang here. Love these real retro style taillights on both ends on the Cooper S. And the overall presence of the car is beautiful. Oh, what's this? Gotta like the looks from both the rear and the front. It looks spectacular. And what about the inside? Very retro, very attractive. You get an auto or a manual gearbox in these cars. And they are incredible little cars to rip around in, but the problem is all the mechanical issues, particularly in the earlier models. I'll give you some examples. CVT and transmission related issues in some of the earlier cars, electric problems here galore, and the bigger issue, of course, is the engine. Not just leaks from coolant and antifreeze, you also have carbon fouling, but the big problem is the timing chain rattle. Did you realize if that rattles long enough, parts can break and all of a sudden you get piston and valve connection, which is bad. Interference engine means instant engine destruction. Could you imagine if you combined all of that style and that unique appeal and driving dynamic with the security and reliability of an electric motor and batteries to eliminate all those leaks and potential catastrophic engine failures? This here is a Volkswagen Jetta. You can find it in Golf, Audis, A3s, A4s, Skodas, you name it, the VAG Group Special. That's right, there's an engine associated with this that have lots of issues. Now, it's specific, I'll mention, it's a diesel. And diesels in these vehicles were also very, very popular. I mean, these cars came with great alloy wheels, simple little mirrors. Of course, you can't recognize the Mark IV front end on these vehicles. You do have these style of headlights, which is a bit of the transition to the newer design theme. Of course, this one's Volkswagen. As you can see, that's sort of the giveaway on this design. Lots of people carry stuff on the roof because these are very versatile vehicles for the people. But what specific are kind of issues before we actually tell you what the engine code is? Volkswagen's used a couple of different fuel injection processor systems. Siemens and Bosch. It was a Siemens system that seemed to be a little more problematic in the way the vehicle would operate, and so Bosch was clearly the favorite. The dual cam systems in these vehicles had problems with turbochargers, the dual mass flywheels, and many of the other electronics that I've already mentioned, because Siemens was actually a more problematic system. But unfortunately, it was the balance shaft was the large part of the engine problems here. Now, we also know Porsche struggle with a lot of intermediate shaft issues, and very similarly, we have a problem here in more VAG products like we're seeing in this car. Again, in theory, turbo diesel engines are made to run a long time, and sadly, this one was one of those rare exceptions where there was just way too many problems with it. And so what kind of engine code can you expect to avoid right now? Well, you really want to avoid this engine, which is called the EA188, and it's specifically the one with the piezo injectors. Those piezo injectors are huge money. We're talking about $1,800 to $2,000 each if they blow, and they're commonly fail points. So definitely one of those vehicles with the problematic engines you definitely want to avoid like the plague, because it won't make 50,000 miles. Another one is this wild looking little car behind us is a Kia Sportage, and these are great looking little cars. I can see why people are attracted to that. It has a very stout, kind of sporty looking front end on it specifically. I mean, look at the front end. It looks elevated, popped up, and it just looks like it's ready for some playtime. Great little headlights on there of this Kia, and you have this wonderful grille. How about that front end? I love that style. Everything looks like it's stepped up in terms of quality. I would say it looks flashier than your average Toyota RAV4. It even has plastic guards all the way along to protect the paintwork from rocks. Of course, you have these beautiful two-tone handles back and front, and an interesting little mirror with the side lights. How about these windows? I love that contour at the very top, how it kind of juts down. Even more impressive is this hood, how it sort of flares up at the sides, and it makes it look very strong and staunch. Look, you've even got these great little flares here, makes the vehicle look sporty. Of course, it's all-wheel drive, so it's great in the snow and the mud. And of course, it's got that beautiful running gear on top to haul that bed bug infested mattress to the dump. Great little rear finishing here, has that sharp drop off overhang, and beautiful LED taillights at the back. Nice little chrome strip, makes this car look very sharp from pretty much every angle. Love these little marker lights on this Sportage by Kia, and it's an EX variation. It even has a very interesting rear finishing, how it sharpens down at the back. The car looks very sporty. How about the interior? Actually, the quality of the interior looks very, very good, and they're certainly improving year on year to make these Kias and Hyundais in line with a lot of the more premium models within the Japanese variations. But there's a problem. There's a big problem. If only these were electrified. Why? Because the 2-liter and a 2.4-liter GDI engines, boom, there's a recall because they have been known to catastrophically fail. How is that? Well, somehow during a little thing they call machining process, what they did was they left some burrs behind. So there's a little metal particulate that wound up in the oil passages of the engine and the crankshaft. So when the vehicle starts to be put in commissioned and put into service, the oil basically carries some of those filings through the engine, and in some cases locks up some of the cooling passages, so the rod bearings underneath the engine at the bottom of the reciprocating mass start to overheat. When that happens, these cars have been known to burn up roadside. On top of that, there's a hydraulic electronic control unit that have been known to burn up even at will when the vehicle's parked. And the ABS control unit is also known to burn up. So unfortunately, these vehicles, as great looking as they are, they're suffering a lot of little problems. And while yes, there's lots and thousands of very happy owners of these vehicles, sadly, there's many, many unhappy vehicle owners that have been left roadside and even have been put out physically by the results of this poor construction in these vehicles. So could you imagine if this great little vehicle was powered by electrification? Guess what? Hyundai and Kia now are quickly advancing their electrified motor drivetrains because some of these engines they just want to put in the rearview mirror and forget all about it. So if you can get this with only electrification, you probably got a winner. Another major engine problem is related to the specific brand here. Not this Forester per se with the 3.6, but there's other issues in the EJ20 engines. Subaru is actually known for a high level of reliability, and a lot of their engines will run a long, long time. So this isn't a knock at the whole brand because the brand in general is quite durable. However, there are some problems with specific engines and they definitely won't last, or they'll cost you a lot of money out of your hard-earned paychecks. I mean, if you're talking about the EJ205, 207, and 20G engines, they have a lot of issues related to the intercoolers for the air conditioning. You also have stuck piston rings, which is a bad scene because if your piston rings stick up in the cylinder, basically a seized engine. So that is a problem that's common, and it's related to the treatment of that piston ring, and clearly would need some sort of an engine rebuild to unlock that engine. Then we talk about the EJ20 as you'd find over in other cars, for example, like the Forester Legacy and the Impreza, which this is a WRX, but essentially the base model Imprezas carry the 125 all the way up to 140 horsepower NA versions, and that basically you wind up with with a knock in cylinder number 4. They are 4 cylinders, so you end up with a knocking noise. Knock, 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 knock. And they're also quite prone to seal leaks and leaking oil all over the place through various seals and gaskets. So not a great engine. Again, not necessarily the WRX STI versions, but certainly the base Imprezas. There's also a very specific number of these Subaru engines that actually have blown head gaskets. They comes on very, very quickly and easily. I, as a matter of fact, had a friend that had a slightly older generation of Subaru Forester, the old school, the old boxy style as it were. And he actually had an engine. That car was treated immaculately. Oil services way before their time, took care of it to the T, and still wound up with an engine having to be replaced. He took a trip up to the mountains and a little bit of an acceleration up the mountains, and all of a sudden blowing smoke, hearing the knocking noise, and it needed an engine. So sad state of affairs. There are some weaknesses within the brand. Generally as a whole, they're pretty solid, but the EJ Series 2025 are ones to look out for. And the next one on our list is this little hot rod right behind us here. Now, I know BMW always tends to make the list of some really bad engines, and I haven't spoken about this one for a little bit, but it's very, very true. Now, we're talking about a 1.6 liter or a 2 liter turbo diesel engine. But before we get into the details, let's take a quick look around. What we're looking at here is a 3 Series BMW. I mean, BMWs are always known for their beautiful kidney grills. Of course, they've got that infamous logo, which everybody can't mistake. LED headlights on this particular generation here. Of course, we have a very basic set of wheels, but BMW always has great details like the mirrors, high quality handles with soft touch, sunroof, of course, LED tail lights, and all kinds of trim along the bottom that just makes it look sharp. How about the interior? BMW interiors always feel well put together. They always hold up very well, other than a few of the sticky buttons back in the E series of cars. Well made, well wearing, and suited for fairly hard service. BMW is also known for the best interface. For example, their iDrive systems are always better than most, and every manufacturer aspires to do as good as BMW here. Now, unfortunately, BMW struggles in certain other areas, and that's what we're talking about here today. So the engines we're describing here have about a 1 in 42 chance of failing catastrophically, which is way too much for a premium luxury car like you get in a BMW. Some of the generational cars you can find this engine in are the F20, F22, 32, as well as the F10 and E84 vehicles. And that engine that we're talking about is the N47 engine. That's right, the turbo diesel engine. Horrible. How about 2009 to 2013 in that range? Now, as a lot of BMW owners can attest, coolant leaks from water pumps, thermostats, of course coolant hoses are always a strong possibility, which starts to take a toll on the owner's pocketbook. And it's the pricey technology in electrics that sometimes fail too, like window regulators as well. And there's no beginning or end where you can sustain a failure, and they always cost $1,000 plus every time you take the car in for a repair. But it's really not about all of that, because a lot of luxury cars have pricey repair and service. However, it's the actual timing chain that drives the timing between the pistons and the valves in this particular engine. What we're talking about is a timing chain stretch. And when that timing chain under load starts to stretch, and it was a known issue, what you can start getting is scraping, rattling, very mechanical noises that just don't sound quite right. A lot of times those noises will be more prevalent in cold weather startups. You'll hear that grrrt real quick, or you can hear it at idle with low oil pressure. When the vehicle's idling and everything's just stable, sometimes you'll hear a bit of rattly noise that does take out of its normal diesel frequency. You would kind of hear an off sound. Every diesel knocks a little bit, but you'll hear a unique sound. And the problem is, similar generation, the N20, which is the turbo gas jobby in the same vehicle, has a very similar problem, and we're talking about timing chains that are failing. And regardless, gas, diesel, when they fail, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars to replace an engine, because that's usually what it means. So for those few years between 09 and 13, the turbo diesel and the turbo gas jobby, the N47 and the N20 engines, are definitely ones to kick to the curb and don't even bother. In today's day and age, there's very little reason to go with the diesel, and if I can offer up, if you really have to have a BMW, go with the modern day B48 engine. That's a turbo 4, seems to be far more reliable than the outgoing N20. It's modular, efficient, and powerful. The first trash bag of an engine that you can find is in this little BMW here. This one has garnered a lot of reputation for distrust because it's so untrustworthy, because it's guaranteed to actually fail. Of course, we have this generation starting to get into LED taillights. We have the single exhaust tips there and a very simplistic kind of design, typical BMW style. Yeah, they have great beefy handles and they always last, and a small sunroof, which is fine as well. Little fold away mirrors with the LED strip, that's great. But look, LED angel eyes, the big grill, but look, yes, unfortunately it had to be towed into the dealership because it won't run under its own power. And unfortunately the 3 Series BMWs equipped with the N20, that's right, the turbocharged 4-cylinder engine from approximately 10 years ago, is where you want to stay away from. That N20 engine had a lot of issues related to oil filter housing gaskets leaking. You have valve cover gaskets, timing chains that would blow up catastrophically, coolant leaks, water pumps, you name it. Coolant, oil, can't keep it in there. It's always on the ground in some format. And unfortunately, as a result, you could expect to see out of 100 cars, approximately 260 visits to the dealer for repairs that you really didn't want to incur. With that N20, you would also anticipate close to 10 grand in 10 years, $1,000 a year just for basic maintenance. Now the maintenance itself isn't that much. We're talking a couple, $200-300, but unfortunately when you get hit with a few of those big doozy repairs, that's when it starts bumping up the average. And sadly, the N20 engine is clearly not one that you want. And that's where it belongs. And there's the next vehicle that won't last 100,000 miles. You know what? The first time I experienced one of these Chevy Cruzes like we see here was a few years back in Las Vegas. It was a rental car. At first, it seemed like a fun little car. After about 15 minutes, the novelty and the honeymoon literally wore over. But let me talk about some of the issues, other than the fact that when I first got out of the car, the door dropped down. I opened the door and it seemed to drop about a ½ an inch. So it felt right away like body integrity was a little bit of an issue right there. And I didn't even know anything about these at the time. Chevy Cruze, as we see right here, this is the LT. And of course, there we go in all of its glory, buried in snow where it probably should be buried under dirt. Funky little tail lights, as you see right there. And yes, it even comes with a set of alloy wheels. Circle around to the front and they have a great little set of headlights on there on this little Chevy, and they have this pointed front nose, which makes it look a little bit on the sporty side. You can see everything from coolant leaks, steering and suspension issues, and electrical accessories that cause a lot of problems and grief for the owner, and even some throttle lag in certain models. But the worst thing is there's lots of customers that have gone by the dodo bird and have had to throw this car straight to the dumpster because of cracked pistons. That's right, detonation, cracked pistons, ring lands, and the entire engine was shot. Transmissions go like they're going out of style, poorly built, not made to hold up all that well, and quite frankly, if you got to put a transmission in for 5 grand or 10 grand for an engine, you're quickly going to outrun the value of this car, and it's no point in keeping it around any longer than that. And that's also why this vehicle won't last more than 100,000 miles. What are we exactly looking at here? Well, it is a Fiat. Yes, it's essentially based on the Italian make. Of course, yeah, it's got the big bug eyes and additional lights there. Similar to the Nissan Juke in that regard. Of course, you have the big wings right there and this fancy little front nose on there. Yeah, they have great wheels like that. Fun little marker lights and great little mirrors. Big sunroof on top. Of course, look at that. Oh, look, we have peeling going on right here. Quality control issues right there. Flipper, and look, of course, we have these cute little rear tail lights. Of course, we have a hitch on there, but I wouldn't dare tow anything with that because you'll blow the gearbox. Of course, down there we have a little carboned up exhaust tip, and we're looking at the Fiat 500L like that. Of course, you have this big barrel back looking deal back here, of course, with that big door that opens up so you can throw a bunch of junk in the trunk. And look at all the grease on the wheels. You can put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. But there's lots of little issues with this, and likely the engine won't last very long as it's a 1.6 liter. Overworked, underpaid. Of course, there's problems when you're turning to the left. It makes clunking and banging noises. The infotainment touchscreen system doesn't work sometimes. Of course, inside on the steering wheel housing, because of bad wiring in the steering base, you can actually expect electrical faults throughout, which ultimately can create a lot of other little problems and gremlins. But one big issue, of course, as I mentioned before, so this has electric problems. It also has transmission issues where it's surgy, hunty. Of course, there's lots of problems with the clutches, and there's a lot of frequency of customers having issues dealing with clutch and transmission issues with these vehicles. Sending them back to the shop, they just don't drive properly and don't get a ton of miles or service factor on a lot of the transmissions. Which blows my mind why anybody would try to put a trailer hitch on something like this. There's also people complaining about exhaust warning lights, low engine oil lights. Even if it was recently changed and you've topped up the oil and verified that the oil was topped up, you still could see low oil pressure and low oil level warning lights. The worst part is you get a turbocharger in there too. That's another point of failure, and not an uncommon failure that is too. And again, any turbo in a modern import vehicle is going to cost you probably $3,000–4,000. And a big problem too is the fact that you need a very special formulation because of this multi-air engine configuration. If you don't use the very precise type, quantity, volume, and weight of oil, you will have engine problems. Unfortunately, that is a common issue. Of course, there was a write on some of the software and drivability issues with the engine because of some software updates traced back to actually, unfortunately, a module. A lot of little engine issues. It's sensitive to fluctuations and changing in the right oil. They're minor, they're weak little engines. If you're very gentle with them, they might last a little while, but I guarantee you, you won't see too many of these on the road in 5 years. And the next little hot rod is this unit here, problematic beyond. Yes, that's right, 2008 to 2012, 13 in that range. It's 4 cylinders, yes. It's turbocharged, yes. And boy, does it have failures. As a matter of fact, 1 in 27 vehicles are known to sustain some level of catastrophic engine failure, which means big dollars out of the pocket for you and I if we happen to own this particular car. It's a sad state of affairs. But first, let's take a quick look and understand why people even buy these and why not just save yourself the hassle. Beautiful LED headlights by Audi. Of course, they've got a basic looking mirror setup, but it does have soft touch to get in, front and back. Of course, they have their LED tail lights, which is great. Set of dual pipes at the bottom. And if you look down the side, this car has some nice contours to it. Pardon that little scrunch on the front. Obviously, this thing had a little clip, but it does have a sunroof. And it has all-wheel drive because it's a quattro system. And it seems like a sensible car to buy. I mean, all-wheel drive is good for all weather around. Of course, you have the luxury amenities. Why wouldn't people buy a car like this? It's because of the engine is why you don't want that car. And the engine specifically is from the VAG group, the Volkswagen Audi group. And you can find similar problems in the Volkswagens that we've previously discovered. But we're talking Audi version. And this is the 2-liter TFSI engine from 08 to 12. Now there's a series of engine codes from CAEB, CDNC, CNDC. That's right, there's a different engine codes specifically to the problem areas. One being turbo seals. Of course, with some time, the seals start to burn out and you've got turbo problems, but that can happen on any turbo car. PCV and related codes, where it doesn't get the proper ventilation and you can cause that to back up and have issues. Intake manifold, you betcha, plastic, big bucks, as well as problematic, and tend to leak. Fuel pumps, fuel injectors, very expensive, and yeah, they fail, and frequently. Water pumps, thermostats, and just coolant dropping out of the bottom there on a regular basis. We can't forget, because it's a direct injected engine, we're dealing with carbon buildup, and not only that, you can have oil leaks. For example, on the cam housing, pan gaskets, intake manifolds, this thing can leak, it's a leaker. But it's not all those other little incidentals which can really literally break the bank. It's the real big problem is a heavy oil consumption. And Audi says, hey, you're good for 1,000 miles between a quart. But in practice, a lot of people are finding that they're actually going through a quart in about 500 or 600 miles, which well exceeds factory approved amount. One sign clearly is the low oil light pops up way too frequently. Between oil changes, you might have to do it a few times. And if we're being honest, some of the contributing factors here are piston rings and the poor fitment of that. And so it allows oil to get by. Too much oil consumption just gets in everything, gums everything up. And then because it's loose and it's already starting to excessively wear, because loose pistons, loose rings can start to slap around in the cylinders. And the more slop you get, the more exacerbated wear that you can see as a result of that. As a matter of fact, it can get so bad if you leave it untreated, you can wind up with broken piston rings, broken crowns, scored cylinders, and it might mean major overhaul work. So there's 3 different stages that the manufacturer might offer up. First one is a reprogram with a new engine case. Because it's scored and damaged, they may replace that. Stage 2 could end up costing about $6,000 to replace conrods, piston rings, and pistons, and a reprogram. But stage 3 might be a whole new engine. And that could literally cost up to $15,000 to $20,000, depending which market we're talking about here. It's way beyond the price of and value of what some of these cars are even worth these days. So as you can see, it's clearly not worth it. What I'd suggest is possibly get yourself a newer, latest generation A4 if you have to have an Audi, but if you don't have to have an Audi, maybe go with the Lexus IS with the all-wheel drive. Much better, much more reliable, and you won't deal with any of these headaches. And here's another car that I wish you could get electrified because the engines are so bad in some of these Volkswagen Beetles that it's beyond belief. But let's take a quick look around and then I'll explain some of the key issues. There we are, we have this beautiful car here, obviously going for the retro look. 100% we've got the headlights, the bug-eyed looks for sure by this Volkswagen, and they have a great interesting front spoiler and a very retro looking hubcap. What about these little mirrors? Beautiful. And the running boards there look sharp as well. And of course we flare out here at the back, very retro, consistent with the Volkswagen Beetle from back in the day. Semi-modern taillights. And a small simplistic handle consistent with the rest of the brand. The interior is even going for a slightly retro look as well. So overall, it's a beautiful car all the way around. Could you imagine with that convertible top down and the sun shining? And instead of hearing that engine rattling, wouldn't it be much nicer just to hear the whistling of the air through your ears with that roof down on a sunny Sunday afternoon? Maybe find your favorite back roads, because the engine that you'll find under the hood of these vehicles are often very problematic. You want a few examples? Let's start at the front, because the engine's not at the back anymore like the old original Beetle. Now it's at the front, but these engines are full of problems. Number one is valve cover gasket leaks. That's a problem. Leaks as well as smoke, possibly down the exhaust manifold. And nothing's more embarrassing than sitting in traffic in the hot summer and you see smoke coming from underneath the hood. There's also check engine lights, which are common, and more importantly, overheating is a very, very common problem with some of these engines. But get past all of that nonsense, we won't even talk about the electrics and some of the other module problems with these vehicles. The big one is engine rattle. Sometimes you get a difficulty starting, and often you get a rattling noise from under the hood. So what is that rattling noise? It's called the timing chain. And when the timing chain starts rattling, that's an indication that the chain is too loose, often because of low oil pressure, or certainly because of timing chain ramps and hardware. If that timing chain actually skips a cog or two, you wind up with a catastrophic engine failure. And why is that? Well, simply because piston, valve, connection, game over. So while it's a beautiful car, very cool, very stylish, and even better with the convertible than the coupe, one really can't help wonder how much better this car could be if you could plug it in and drive away without an ounce of a problem. The Volkswagen Beetle Cabrio. So the first one is unfortunately one that really pains me to say it. Great little vents on the front and a beautiful flare on the front, and has a very strong rocker panel along the sides. Of course, we have a little rear wing. And when you look underneath, you'll see you've got quad exhaust tips, and it fires out that really odd engine exhaust note. Here's Subaru, and as I mentioned, one of the best all-wheel drive systems on the market today. These cars have a sunroof on top, beautiful rally blue paint all over this car, the latest LEDs from Subaru, and some amazing wheels, even with the big calipers on there. You've got keyless touch, and a great interior that's not over the top, however, it's very functional and well-wearing. So you get a 6-speed manual gearbox as well as a well-bolstered set of seats. And we have a beautiful little Subaru WRX STI parked behind me here, and it's up to 2018. There's actually been some lawsuits regarding the FA 2.0 and the J 2.5. 2.5 is the engine you'll find typically turbocharged in the STI like we have here. And it's really unfortunate because Subaru is often known for a high level of reliability. The all-wheel drive system as well is literally one of the most robust and perfected systems on the market today. But what in fact is the issue with these engines in the WRXs and the WRX STIs like we see right here? Well, first of all, great cars. That's why people buy them. You can see that great little intercooler tucked in there, and there's an STI. It almost sounds like a condition. You may want to check out your doctor to get some medication to take care of that. So what in fact is the problem with these engines? Well, as you know, these are a boxer, so they're a flat 4-cylinder engine. They're horizontally opposed. That in itself isn't the issue. What is the issue is the PCV that recirculates some of the emissions, puts it back into the intake. But the problem with that is it's malfunctioning, and you have a ringland in the pistons that wind up taking a hit due to detonation indirectly caused by a faulty PCV. And if ringlands start failing, then you actually have your piston rings start collapsing, breaking, splitting, and ultimately no compression and potentially catastrophic engine failure altogether. Now there have been a lawsuit filed, and vehicles in as little as 80,000 miles are starting to see some major engine failures. And as a result, until these issues get sorted out, it's probably one of those engines you really want to stay away from. So what does this vehicle, this one, an Optima, Forte, and a Sorento all have in common? Well, it's the engine that you can find in some of those vehicles that goes back several years, and there's been so many recalls because of one key issue. Well, let's not get silly. There's actually many recalls, 60 recalls in fact, because of engine issues. And the engine in question that has caused lots of heartache are the Theta 2 engines, the GDI engines, and the Gamma GDI engines. Now, what's so bad about those engines? Well, other than the fact over 3,000 fires have occurred and over 100 people have been injured, and even worse in one case, means that the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration is all up in their business over some of these engine issues. Yeah, well, what's causing those engine issues? Well, a lot of times you don't even know. Check engine light, boof, car stops. Other cases, knock, 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 you're hearing a knocking noise, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, the engine just boof, makes a loud noise and clunk and stops. Other cases, poof, it blows up in flames, and you have flames billowing out from under the hood. Let's not fool anyone here. This is a scary situation, and the recalls have been there to actually supply support for people who are on the wrong end of that spectrum. It ultimately means many replaced engines on behalf of Kia and Hyundai, which is their sister company, who also have the same issue because they share the same engines. And quite frankly, it's more than an inconvenience. And allegedly, the companies were very, very slow in reacting where the first cases started coming in. Then hundreds of cases came in. Then thousands of cases came in, and it could not be denied because engines were getting replaced left, right, and center. A lot of people were struggling getting those engines replaced or getting rental cars to replace what they were offset by. It was an ugly situation, and now Kia and Hyundai are having to pick up all the pieces that fell on the ground or the smoke that billowed into the sky. The reality is it doesn't take very long to look around to find vehicles that are subject to that recall. There's also been other recalls recently with Kia related to piston rings and bad treatment and issues with them locking up, or air conditioning system problems and ABS modules failing and blowing. So the bottom line is it's a problematic engine configuration. And while you'll find hundreds and thousands of people who are very satisfied with the latest generation from this brand, the reality remains those two engines are ones you definitely want to stay away from. They won't last 50,000 miles, at least without rebuilding or replacing the engine. And behind us here, it pains me also to say, because the Volvo brand has always been notoriously known for being safe and reliable. But unfortunately, in 2013 to 2016, there's problems afflicting both the 4-cylinder 2-liter as well as the 2.5-liter 5-cylinder engine. So here we have a pair of beautiful white Volvos. Here we have an older generation, you can tell, because the headlights, old school, and the new ones have the LEDs, as well as a newer style grille. This one here is a 2019 and this one's not. And I'll be honest, Volvos have come a long way, not just from a safety standpoint, but as well from a styling perspective. Let's take a look and compare. Not only do the older ones have more engine issues than the newer ones, but the newer ones have really stepped up the game. Beautiful chrome trim, wonderful, very aggressive looking spoiler, beautiful wheels, and of course you get these nice little indentations. And the rocker panel is nicely trimmed in chrome. And as well, you have all kinds of keyless access there. And you'll notice it's got a nice flair to it. These vehicles definitely have a nice road presence. Personally, I've always enjoyed the look of these vertical lights that you'll find on this model, as well as you see on this version as well. Here we're looking at, from this Volvo, a T6. Wonderful little rear diffuser down here. And over here on this version, we have the dual exhaust tips. And this is a T6 as well. You can see there's subtle changes between the two, but clearly, this one here does away with some of the other little accents that you find on the fender wells. The rocker panels aren't as pronounced. The door handles are a little older school. And even the mirrors are nicer with these LED touches on there versus these ones here. Now they both have large sunroofs. And I would literally argue and say these Volvos now have brought up the quality of the interiors to anything that the Germans are putting out in BMW, Audi, or Benz. Well, the problem is, in those few years that came out, there's been a lawsuit that alleges that there's heavy excessive oil consumption that not only leads to you having to add more oil, but it leads to further engine deterioration. They're saying all that excess oil consumption results in further contamination, fouling of plugs, reduced output power because the combustion chambers become coated and are fighting off combustion due to the coating of the oil inside. Now, it's really unfortunate because Volvo's a beautiful brand. They've really stepped up their game for styling and performance. And now who else uses a modern engine that's both turbocharged and supercharged, as well as coupled up with electric drive? Only Volvo is the one that I'm aware of. So it's unfortunate, even though there's a lot of cars out there with oil consumption issues, for my own personal peace of mind, I'd personally stay away from those vintage years of the Volvo with the 2-liter and 2.5-liter 5-bangers. That's the next little hot rod SUV crossover that we're talking about. Borderline car, but most would call it some sort of sport crossover vehicle. And what we're looking at here is a little Korean special. And what is it? it's a Hyundai for sure. And you look, they have their great grills, but sadly there's problematic engines in some of these. Let's take a look around. You have great little sunroofs and mirrors, beautiful wheels all the way around, and then of course on the back here you have this great little touches and accents, LEDs now. Interesting little, busy little taillight assembly, but we're talking about a 1.6T all-wheel drive in the Kona specifically. What's the interior like? Certainly a price point car, but hitting above its weight class, I would say. Now the issue isn't so much in the 1.6, it's more often the 2-liter engines that we're specifically talking about. There's been a lot of troubles along the way for a lot of these, and a lot of owners sadly have felt the wrath of what a bad engine can feel like. Things like stalling issues while you're driving along, oil consumption, shooting oil at the chute, engine knocking, clock, 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 clock. In some cases, potential oil leaks which could lead to a fire. Now, unfortunately, the problem is with the 2-liter engine, there's an issue in the piston rings in some cases in some engines. Poor machining and installation results in a catastrophic engine failure. What kind of failure is that? The connecting rod through the engine block and outright engine replacement required. Now, unfortunately, all of this saddled on the fact that Hyundai and Kia have had numerous different engine problems. Meaning, while some people are loving their vehicles, their Hyundais and Kias, others are struggling with real catastrophic problems. But it doesn't just end with the engine, there's a bunch of other things that you have to consider when you're driving these vehicles. For example, like airbags have been a problem, delayed shifting in the transmission because of fluid levels, meaning that overall, this particular car is a little bit of a risk. And the next one on our list is what's under the hood of this little unit. Beautiful headlights. And of course, I love the front finishing on this. You've got these great little high gloss pieces, wonderful wheels, and look at this little accent, how cute. And you've got more high gloss mirror action. Look at your controls right in the window there. So it allows the thieves to get their hand in there if your window's slightly ajar and open it and get in altogether. Here you've got keyless. Look, you got the cute little key symbol right there. And you've got the keyless access back here by Land Rover. Here you've got that nice little overhang, typical SUV by today's standards. Everything smaller typically now has these little overhangs, but they have these very intricate looking little taillights on this Sport HSE. Of course, by Land Rover. You got one pea shooter and a second pea shooter at the bottom. Sure is a cute looking little vehicle now, isn't it? Now, is the interior at least worth the hassle? I would say it's nothing too much to write home about. Very basic, very Spartan, and very boring. If you want to lease them and you really have to have one, go right ahead. Just know this, once warranty's up, whoa, guarantee's off. If you want to get rid of it at that time, make sure it's somebody that you don't really like, maybe a coworker, or possibly that clown that's been nagging you for years. That's probably somebody worth handing it over to. However, these have problems. But let's look. Land Rover, as we say, and it's a Discovery. Soon to be discovered that you have a head gasket issue. Well, if you scale this back another decade or so, and even including some of today's models, I've got some friends in the business that work on these regularly at third-party shops, and they share a lot of this information with me. Some of these issues go back to the new model versions like this, and some go back about 10 or 12 years. But either way, I'm going to give you a summary of all the issues. One being the rear hatch sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, locks up by itself. The rear air suspension sometimes settles out, and that's a problem on those models equipped. Transfer case oil leaks, engine oil leaks, heavy oil consumption, whether it's dripping on the ground or it's burning it internally. Coolant leaks seem to be very prevalent in a lot of these, through the throttle body, whether it's radiator fittings, HVAC issues, window regulators, check engine lights for O2 sensors. And a couple of customers I've heard of saw the critically low oil level issue pop up regularly. So they clearly have some issue with oil consumption, coolant loss, and the like. So personally, if it were me, I'd steer clear from the Discovery. The first junky engine that I recommend staying away from is buried under the hood of this little unit right here. Now what we have here is a BMW Mini, and everybody knows that they're strongly affiliated with BMW. But let's take a quick look around at the car and first understand why people even try to buy these things in the first place. They have gorgeous little wheels and cool little retro handles, oversized glass on the roof, as well as wonderful plastic around the wheel wells, great little front grille, and of course the bug-eyed little headlights. Then you go down here and you have other great accents. How about those retro-looking mirrors? And then around the back, what we're looking at is a Cooper, and of course by BMW. This one has a single tailpipe, but look at all the carbon buried in there. And the interior is kind of fun too, that's why people buy these. Very retro. You can get manual, automatic, and it's got some great styling accents. There's some higher quality components because this is based on a BMW, so people feel good driving these. And they are kind of fun to drive. And the worst part is, at least 1 in 40 of these is guaranteed to have a major engine catastrophe. It's a known issue, and it's a very pricey one too. Now, many of the problems were teething issues, and a lot of the earlier generation cars had a lot more issues. The 2007 to 2014 model years had a problem called oil starvation. They weren't getting enough adequate oiling to some of the upper engine components, resulting in early cam lobe wear as well as other internal engine parts. Other issues where they developed some kind of a shake because engine mounts, you could have coolant leaks from all kinds of different cooling hoses. Again, it's BMW. Water pump issues in there. In the 2007 to 2014, you could get oil starvation where inadequate oiling was made to the internal engine compartments, resulting in premature cam lobe wear as well as piston rings. You have lots of issues there and engines just wearing out way too soon. Shaking of motor mounts because they got a little loose and old and aged before their time. Leaks from both oil and antifreeze because we have essentially a BMW drivetrain and that's what they do. Coolant leaks from hoses, pipes, thermostat, as well as the electric water pump. You could also expect variable valve timing issues with some of these cars where you'd start getting poor running conditions. The car would be lurchy off the start. It wouldn't have the pickup and get up and go, or it wouldn't advance enough and give you the breathing capacity to give you the higher end output. You generally would know if your variable valve timing was failing. You also had electric system issues, whether it was engine related or just general electric, that could cause the car to either stall, die, or just not function at all entirely. Smoke was another potential issue with some of the cars if they prematurely wore out and the engine was dying. These also had other issues like related to transmission, but we won't talk about that today. The other big issue with the engine, why these vehicles generally won't last, is between 2005 and 2016, you had the timing chain issues. Timing chain stretch, if they jumped a cog, you'd have piston and valve connection, and of course, boom! The engine was actually shot at that point, dead in the water. That is what BMW struggled with a lot of their engines. This one's no different. The N20, the N47, as well as the N63 were other examples of BMW drivetrains that struggle with issues related to timing chains. Now, where there's going to be a lot of stories of people making 200,000 miles with their cars, generally that's a very difficult target to make, especially if you're talking about the early generation BMW Minis. As a matter of fact, 100,000 miles is more likely a target on the early cars. If you can make it, count yourself lucky. So it's difficult to find a great alternative to the car like this because it's retro, fun, quirky, and it's very unique by its very styling. But if you really just want to forego all the engine issues related to these Minis, if I can suggest, go with a good old-fashioned Honda Civic, similar price point, 10 times the reliability.
And there's the next SUV that's got a lot of engine problems. What is it?
Well, first of all, it is an attractive little European sports.
First of all, hint, it's a VW. Obviously, you look down the side, it's got some great aluminum trim, great little mirrors.
Of course, the inside is very, very well equipped and nicely done.
Of course, you got a roof rack to haul that roach-infested mattress to the dumpster. Right there, you got a great set of taillights, and it's a Tiguan right there by VW. And we're talking about the 2-liter TSI. Now, it's a great-looking little unit down the sides. Of course, you have some nice contours, and you got plastic guards to protect it from the rocks. Infamous Volkswagen grille, and of course, you've got the nice little projector lamps up front. But what is actually the issue with this particular vehicle?
Where should we start? Why don't we just start with some check engine lights that you can see very frequently with this vehicle?
How about a P0300 to 304 check engine light, and that's related to misfires?
Ignition coil packs. And now a lot of you guys are going to say that's maintenance. Yes, but they burn them out far too frequently.
How about another check engine light called P3081? And it might actually have to do with water pumps that are failing. It could spit out a code, or it just could result in the engine starting to overheat and cause all kinds of real big problems.
I mean, after all, aluminum heads, aluminum block, overheat that and you're in a real world of hurt. You might as well almost throw that engine out.
Another thing you can get is the N80, which is the purge valve in the evaporation system. Obviously has to do with the recirculation of the toxic airs and gases to go back into the intake manifold. That can clap out and cause you a check engine light. Plastic intake manifold, that cracks, splits, and when that happens,
you could actually literally get problems with leaking intake air manifold and fuel mixture, resulting in poor running. Of course, if that plastic intake manifold breaks, splits, cracks, leaks, you're just going to have running issues, possibly check engine light. lights, and just a huge repair bill ahead of you.
And the biggest thing with this particular engine isn't all the check engine lights and the problems and the leaking and the coolant and the leaking oil. It's actually the timing chains, but it's more specifically the chain tensioners. The tensioners let go, that timing chain, which keeps your pistons and your valves in sync, can actually slip out of whack, your chain can flip, and of course you can have valve and piston connection, which means a catastrophic boom. And again, if you blow an engine, you're looking at $6,000 to $10,000 to get something rebuilt and get it sorted out. So these are all very common issues, unfortunately, with these vehicles. There's other things too, for example, like the HVAC system, the clock spring on the airbag. There's a lot of little miscellaneous problems you'll find with these vehicles.
But there's way more than enough engine issues to even choke a horse with this Volkswagen Tiguan.
It's the Defender here by, of course, Land Rover. Of course, they have some great new designs. These are obviously the redesign, and it's much fresher look. For sure, you can get it either 4-door or 2-door setup, and clearly these are designed for utilitarian purposes. A lot of people enjoy driving these off-road because they're designed for that. I mean, look, you have access to the top to grab all of those parcels and packages. Of course, right here you have this off-road wheel access here, so if you're stuck balls deep in the mud right there, you're able to climb on out and grab this so it's not buried underneath the vehicle, it's actually up on the side. Of course, you have some very cool flares here. Interesting little accent there. Look at these beefy looking handles, and look at that theme. I gotta love that little theme, and it matches the checker plate look on top of the hood here. It's just an overall very interesting looking vehicle all the way around, but unfortunately, they don't come without their problems. As a matter of fact, out of 100 vehicles, you would expect 273, that's right, a whopping 273 to see the dealer unexpectedly for massive failures. Everybody says don't necessarily buy the first year of every new generation. And unfortunately, there's already a recall because of cam housing leaks. Just a devastating turn of events. Could you imagine having to disassemble your engine 3 years later once a warranty just disappears and goes up in smoke? That would be devastating. I'd hate to see that kind of a bill. So it doesn't build confidence in the fact that it'll outlast much else out there, let alone a Kia or a Hyundai. Those vehicles are brutal. This possibly could even top it if you can believe it. And sadly, one of its brothers from the JLR group has suffered some issues as well related to the 5-liter V8 engine that initially started out as a Ford and transitioned to an actual Jaguar drivetrain. You can expect some issues, rear differential oil leaks. Of course, the engine, you had fuel injector problems leaking down. Those direct injectors are big bucks, and the fuel pump as well. So clearly not necessarily the most durable of brands. But I mean, let's face it, a car like this, you sort of put up with some of the nuances because it's clearly worth it. A Defender, not so sure. This little unit right here. Now, this is my personal car, and I can speak from direct experience. Mercedes-Benz, as we look right here, has a stealthy reputation for being one of the very bottom. Right now, they are one of the lowest in terms of overall reliability. Let me explain a few things why I don't think this car here will make it 100,000 miles. Let's take a quick look. We wanted to buy this because we wanted something unique and different. They're gorgeous. I mean, all starts with these gorgeous artistic looking headlights and beautiful starlight grille on there. Of course, you have these beautiful rims. And look, rocker panels that are flaring out. We have these gorgeous lines and these haunches that make this vehicle look very stealthy. Gorgeous rear taillights, all LED, pop-out reversing camera, and this whole car just has a beautiful stance to it. Absolutely gorgeous. But let me just take this from the top. Some of the things that we've been experiencing, and I truly do believe a lot of these lower-end Mercedes-Benz cars are not built for the long haul. Just look in the local trader, look at the local classifieds, and you won't see a ton of these vehicles with those higher miles. Yeah, there's lots in the lower range, but try to find some well over 100,000 miles, good luck. But take a look. Check low beam. Check right low beam. Active brake assist function. Issues with this. Blind spot assist. So that's just the beginning of where this all starts. Obviously, these vehicles have way too much technology, and a lot of electronics means that you have to come to the dealer. It's funny, when you look at a lot of these faults on the dashboard and you look in the owner's manual like it tells you to here, all it does is say, go to get to a certified center. Basically, it means money out of your pocket. That's why a lot of people get tired of paying the high dollars. Of course, in warranty time, it doesn't matter. Once you're outside of warranty, that's where it gets expensive. We are also also developing some noises as your vehicle rolls. There's a bit of a grinding, crunching noises at low speed as you're slightly turning the wheel. We also have noisy brakes in these vehicles. And quite honestly, I've heard of stories now, if you browse the forums, people talking about hold pistons because of detonation PCV issues and possibly just low grade of fuel taking a toll and blowing a hole in cylinder number 1 seems to get the radar. So while these are absolutely gorgeous vehicles, the transmissions hold up. It's the electrics, they're literally going to blow you away, rip your wallet out of your hands, and as well, you're thinking about possible engine issues here. That's why I personally don't believe the C-Class, CLA, A-Class, any of those are built for the long haul, and they won't make 100,000 miles. And what we have here is, well, if you look at the Hyundai, of course, they've debadged it because they're embarrassed of what it is. But we look along, yeah, people comment that they like the way it drives and it looks sporty. It's a great competitor with the likes of the Honda Civics and the Toyota Corollas. But at the end of the day, it's not a great vehicle. Even though it has the big grille and it has the great little vents and the funny little headlights. Yes, it looks somewhat sporty, but it's not a great vehicle. And why it won't last 5 years is simple. And it's not the fact that it has brakes and ABS issues that fault out. It's not even about the fact that this vehicle stalls when you're trying to round a corner and loses power. It's not about that the battery dies on it too prematurely. It's not about the fact that the serpentine belt loosens up too easily, you lose charge, you have squealing and howling under the hood. No, it's about the engine. Some of the worst engines you can expect under the hood here of this vehicle right there is a 2-liter 4-cylinder. And what kind of history? Well, it's no secret. Just browse NHTSA, look all over the net. It doesn't take very long. You do some searches on recalls for late model Hyundais and Kias and you'll find a lot of commentary about bad engines. And that's what you can possibly find here. Some of the engine issues are related to ticking, knocking, clunking. And of course, once you start to hear that, usually it's associated with a check engine light, power loss, surging and hunting, and the vehicle isn't quite getting up to where it's got to go. And sometimes it just means a catastrophic boom. A lot of these engines are known to go off the rails because of faulty oil pumps. And sadly, what you can get is broken piston rings, which is another highly known issue with some of these engines. If the piston rings goes, you're going to get clicking, banging, you get piston slap, you'll get oil consumption, and ultimately damage within the engine. If you have to replace an engine on a vehicle like this that's only worth $6,000 on the used car market because it's 3 years old, then you're pretty much up the creek without a paddle. So at the end of the day, Hyundai Elantra and the 2-liter, forget it. Junk. And the next catastrophe of an engine that won't make it 60,000 miles is what's under the hood of this little rig. And the comment directly comes from the Chob Gobbler, who says that there's a lot of issues with this and they have personally had experiences with pretty much every problem I'm about to note here. Well, other than the engine itself, I mean, we know it's a Jeep, we know it's a Cherokee, and clearly it's lacking in durability. Electrics, you could expect. Transmission problems, absolutely, that's a common failure point. But as we get around, it's not a pretty vehicle. I mean, with some basic looking lighting and a tow hitch, which will literally guarantee to blow out that gearbox, as well as alloy wheels that look like something from 1995 called, and a low grade of handle, there's really not a lot to love about this particular Cherokee other than what some people think Jeep actually carries a little bit of street cred. But there's no street credibility because that engine is called the World Gas Engine remake. It's called a 2.4-liter Tiger Shark engine. Yeah, 4-banger. Absolutely. Multi-air, yeah, variable valve timing, air and fuel in, exhaust out. It's just a matter of adjusting the timing on that. And clearly, this is not a good engine. There's a variety of reasons why. How about failing thermostats, which does allow the vehicle to either overheat or underheat, and that will cause problems. Exhaust manifold problems there, where they crack. Have you ever heard of a cracked exhaust manifold? Where they actually spit and it sounds like it's kind of Another big issue, coolant loss, coolant burning. Consumption, oil consumption, which nobody wants an engine that's burning oil, but this Tiger Shark is notorious for that. It's also notorious for carbon up, and as well, they're talking about heavy emissions because it's consuming so much oil. When you put tailpipe emission measurement equipment on it, it actually exceeds what a reasonable amount would be. It also is known for overheating, largely because it can lose coolant or burn coolant, so it's not a great engine, consuming liquids that shouldn't be consumed, and most other components built around it feel very, very fragile, and as a result, you will likely never get 60,000 miles out of one of those 2.4-liter Tiger Shark engines.
Another one of the most popular engine styles because of its versatility, power, performance, and economy is a 6-cylinder engine. Many engines are flat sixes like you'll find in Porsche 911s. Many of them are inline sixes like you find in many BMWs, and many of them are just V6s. While it's a versatile engine type and there's many great reliable engines on the market, unfortunately there are a devastating amount of absolute trash that won't last. Here's an engine, even though this is a great value in the used car market, many people know that the Porsche 911, like we see right here, carries what they call the M96 engine. That's right, the M96 engine is an engine that they utilized in several generations. They used it in the early generation of Boxster from 1997 and up. Then they also used it in the Porsche 911, and they used these 1999 all the way up to around 2005. Access for a lot of the parts are very poor, so maintenance costs are very high. But unfortunately, the reliability isn't very good. This Porsche M96 engine has many issues, like the oil and water separator, which unfortunately has a small diaphragm, can leak through, and then you wind up mixing. That can cause problems. Head gasket problems. You have issues, of course, with water pumps. With the impellers are plastic, break off, they sail down the system, overheat ahead, and then take out your engine. The intermediate shaft bearing issue as well. Everybody knows about that. Unfortunately, they let go, and when they do, catastrophic engine occurs, and you wind up with parts and pieces throughout. It usually means a completely new engine. There's lots of problems with these, like bore scoring because of poor maintenance, and overall reliability is not the most amazing. You also have timing chain tension as they start rattling on a cold start. There's a whole pile of different issues with this newly developed Porsche engine. It's their first liquid-cooled engine in their mainstream cars that they utilize once they moved on from the Porsche 993. So you're finding these engines, the M96, which is a flat six. In this case, we have a 3.4 liter flat six. And you can also find them in the smaller engines and slightly larger, like a 3.6. But unfortunately, it's one of the most problematic engines and guaranteed not to last a hill of beans. Gremlins R Us actually made a recommendation, and it has to do with this German tank we have right here. And unfortunately, Mercedes is known for durability and that quality of German engineering and construction, but sometimes they just sort of miss the boat. And this is an example. So from 2005 to 2011, we can expect and anticipate a certain engine. It's the base engine, 2.5 liter, 3 and 3.5 liter V6 engines that you can get either in the C-Class or in the E-Class Mercedes-Benz. And yeah, Mercedes, look at this. It's a beautiful ride. A gorgeous set of headlights, and it's basically this grille that more or less gives away that generation. You can see beautiful front end on there, alloy wheels. Love that mirror. Look at that right there. That's great. Sunroof on top and a beautiful styling at the back. For the C-Class, we'd expect to see the C230 as the base model engine. That is the one in question. And these different engine configurations come with horsepower ranging for anywhere from about 200 horsepower up to about 312. Some of the big problems you can expect from this engine is oil leakage from the cam plugs. You can expect frequent breaking of the intake manifold because things are plastic and things just aren't built to last. Timing chains, of course, they stretch, and it was built of a substandard material, and they stretch and then they catastrophically fail. Oh, that's all over but the crying when pistons and valves connect, or even just chain rattle is enough to annoy your day. On a cold start, you get that vehicle just rattle up. That's a clear indication that you might have that problem. So the challenges of keeping this vehicle running and serviced are significant. And the timing chain challenges become a result of the balance shaft scenario. And it's not uncommon for a lot of German-made vehicles to have balance shaft issues, intermediate shaft issues. It seems to be a common thread, but this one is certainly no different. And the reality is you can also get coolant leaks, oil leaks, and the like. It just becomes cost prohibitive. The engine's not made to last, and you could actually expect the M272 to actually call it quits between 50, 60, maybe 70,000 miles or higher reported engine lifespans. These engines aren't made for the long haul, and sadly, Mercedes just kind of missed it with the M272. And the next one is this great vehicle behind me here, another SUV. This one's a German-made vehicle, and honestly, I would tell you it's not all that reliable. Why do you think this thing's sitting on the car lot? People can't wait to get rid of them soon enough. Yes, you can get some miles out of them. Yes, you can make them last a fair amount of time if you keep pouring money down the chute. But most people don't want to do that. That's why these vehicles often won't even make it 5 years, because of all the nickel and dime expenses that you're going to see with the Volkswagen Atlas, like we see right back here in dark blue. Now, these were very popular when they first came out because Volkswagen, Euro vehicle, instead of the Tiguan, they finally have a full-size SUV that was competitive with the rest of the market. So people got very excited, the hype was high, and there was a lot of motivation to get out there and buy one of these. But sadly, there's a lot of problems with these vehicles that are going to quickly empty your bank account. But why were people buying these? Well, look right there.
Volkswagen. Big wheels. Of course, you have lots of chrome along the bottom. I love these finishings on the exhaust tips. Of course, there, you've got a hitch receiver there so you can pull a small trailer or a boat. So people were in love with these vehicles. You can open the back there, throw your junk, your couch, your bed, your desk, and even the kitchen sink can fit in there too. Then you have these great lines. Look at that line along the side and you follow it. Absolutely beautiful. Circle around to the front, and it definitely has that Volkswagen look. Softened up Audi for sure. LEDs.
And the interior is actually very well put together, feels very high quality, and takes some tips from the Audi playbook in terms of fit and finish. So what are some of the problems you'd find with these Atlas vehicles? I mean, get past all the smoke and mirrors and the beautiful styling, there's a lot of junk hiding under there waiting to take and suck that money out of your back pocket. But let's get started. Fuel injectors, the original ones, this is a direct injected engine, so it's going to be a very expensive set of fuel injectors. They're high pressure and they're very costly. We're talking about thousands of dollars for a retrofit. They could crack and they could leak. That could result, of course, in a catastrophic fire. Fuel rail, same issue. How do you know you've got fuel injector issues? Well, it could be very hard starting. It could be a rough idle, spits out check engine lights. Fuel economy could decrease. And the outright performance is just going away when your fuel injectors stop working. And of course, if they are cracked and leaking, you will smell gas as well. That's when it gets scary. And another problem is a lot of customers are noticing when they turn the ignition off and the car sputters to a stop, there's a strange noise, like a rattling or a grinding noise. But what Volkswagen's chalking it up to is actually torque converter springs that are causing this strange noise or strange anomaly. Now, while they're saying that this isn't going to cause any long-lasting effects, I'll be honest, that does not inspire a whole lot of confidence. It could result in a torque converter failure down the road somewhere. Just my opinion. And of course, that's attached to the transmission, so what do you think that means? Right. And another big problem that a lot of these vehicles are seeing is, you get that smell of sweet, that sugary smell. Well, if you're smelling that sweetness, that could be coolant loss. Of course, coolant loss can come in many forms, but it's not uncommon with the Volkswagen Atlas. For example, you might see coolant pooling up underneath the vehicle. You may smell the sweet aroma into the cabin. You could have a water pump issue that could be leaking, or any numerous different cooling hoses, radiator, thermostats, and other fittings that carry your cooling system fluid throughout there. Now, without coolant, you can have a problem. Overheating, it lubricates your water pump, does all kinds of positive things for your vehicle. Without coolant, your engine will go boom! And more importantly, there's a bigger issue that causes some of this coolant loss. It's in the cylinder head. Now, there's cases where the cylinder heads weren't properly torqued down, or a leaking valve cover gasket. If you've got an improperly torqued head, sometimes it's just a matter of a mechanic getting in there and doing the proper torquing so it sucks it right down nice and snug. But other times, if you're burning out a valve cover gasket, that could be big troubles, and that might be a partial upper engine rebuild. Another problem is a faulty fuel pump. It could result in rough idle, stalling, difficult starting, and of course just a lacking in fuel delivery to those fuel injectors that we spoke of earlier. If that happens, the vehicle may stall or just not run, be a big problem. And those high pressure fuel pumps are big bucks. Another issue is the clock spring. Right down there on the steering wheel, you actually have the clock spring for the airbag. That does fail as well. Well, if you're turning the steering wheel, you go all the way left, you go all the way right, sometimes you're hearing a creaking noise, squeaking coming from under the steering wheel console. Now, that's not a reliability problem, it just means more money out of the pocket. And more money out of the pocket means that you're more likely to toss this thing in the dumpster way before 5 years. Another one with many problems is what's next on my list, and what we're looking at here is a Jaguar, and I'll get into the specific model for sure right away, but let's talk about a few of the issues. I mean, with this particular car, you can experience problems with coolant leaks. You'll smell the coolant wafting into the cabin. Window regulators that stop working sometimes. Direct injected engines with carbon fouling and smoke out the chute. DSC warning light on the dash that it actually has faulted. The doors rattle and make a little noise, and there's some fit and finish that is a little questionable within these vehicles as well. Now, I personally think they're very gorgeous cars. Look at this Jaguar right here. And we look down the side, they actually have this great little features on the front panel. LEDs on there. Of course, you've got nice two-tone on the handles. Beautiful wheels. And of course, what I really love are these tail finishes here on those lights. Of course, you got one exhaust tip of this XJL Jaguar on the 3-liter engine,
and another exhaust tip. These Jaguars are all a thing of beauty. They have a certain presence and elegance about them that no other car can match. Nothing from Germany even comes close. The problem is, owning one of these upscale premium Jaguars is almost like owning a Land Rover, Range Rover. You almost need a king's ransom to pay for this thing, for the maintenance. It's just extreme. Takes you to another level where the top tier money earners in the globe can actually afford to keep these on the road and running properly. And of course, couple that up with aggressive, and I mean aggressive depreciation, means that there's no value. You're pumping money into a dead money pit. And that's the problem. You're not getting any money return on it. It's just throwing money down the drain. But instead of buying an XJL, if you wanted something with a little more durability, a little more function, a lot more reliability, and better value retention, go with one of these. An Audi S7, A7, or RS7 would be a better solution. If you wanted a long, sleek, luxury car that goes like the wind, this might be a better option. And another one on the list that probably won't make it 5 years, and if it does, it's miraculous because it's just a matter of pride and somebody's just not willing to let it die because they have bragging rights and they don't want to let their friends know that they got beat down by a vehicle that is not very reliable. And what we're talking about is the BMW X5, but not all X5s are the same. Some of the base diesel engines are known to last a long time if it wasn't for the emission systems equipment. But then what we have here is a 35i. This is the N55, so in other words, it's the turbo inline 6 twin scroll, I might add, and it makes decent power. It was relatively reliable compared to the previous generation N54, which was the twin turbo 6-cylinder plant. This engine was a little better, but this car is so complex. And did you realize that after 5 simple short years, once warranty's gone, this vehicle has depreciated to about 40% of its original value? What does that mean? Well, that means usually the first and sometimes even the second owners are gone. They no longer own it. Now we're typically into the third owner of a vehicle like this, a BMW that's often 5 or so years old, and that's when the crap starts hitting the fan and they can't afford to fix these things. But let's talk about a few of the issues. I know these X5s, they look great, and they have the greatest in beautiful LED headlights. Of course, you have this wonderful chin spoiler that looks aggressive. M badging. Of course, you got great little vents on that 35i, and look at that rocker. It looks flared and strong. Of course, around here we have this great LED taillight assembly, and look down there. 1 and 2 tailpipes. It looks very stout. Everything about this vehicle looks very Euro and looks very sporty. This car also has those wonderful colored flares around the fender wells. And of course, look inside. BMWs typically wear very well on the inside. The leather's very durable and the plastics are very well made and nice to the touch. It also has a large glass panel on the roof to allow for illumination in the cabin for all the little chicos and chicas sitting inside. So picture a vehicle like this going for about 100 grand new, and then the third owner comes along after 5 years, and now the vehicle's only worth $25,000, and all of a sudden a bunch of cooling system problems arise. Water pump, thermostat, and maybe a turbo goes because it was poorly taken care of. Now you're at a $10,000 bill, and the third owner is rarely able to take on that size of bill with relative ease. It's an expensive proposition to own these. A friend of mine personally owned one of these with this 6-cylinder, and he had nothing but problems. He had to take this back to the dealer time and time again for a hunting and surging idle issue, the occasional stall. So it had running drivability issues with his vehicle, and he bought it brand new. Fortunately, his was on a lease, so he didn't have to suck it up. So after the 3 years, here you go, keep that piece. But also what you're finding in some of these X5s is the air suspension. It's a self-leveling that keeps it always on the level. Especially good if you have the third row or if you've got the tow package and you want to haul stuff. When you add that extra weight, the self-leveling provides air to a set of airbags that keeps the level and it keeps it nice and stout. Well, that's great when it's working. But when it stops working, that's when this starts happening. You can go aftermarket if you're a good DIYer, but if you're not a DIYer and you got to take it to the dealer, a set of airbags are going to cost you $2,500. Then you have an air compressor that's mounted under here, and all kinds of other bits and pieces that keep this thing at bay. And if any of those parts fail, it's going to cost you some money out of the pocket. We also can't forget, at the 5-year mark beyond depreciation, we have what we call the designed or engineered obsolescence. In my book, according to my opinion, with all the plastic parts that are finding under the hood, you'll have coolant leaks abound. And you'll find, coincidentally, at that 40, 50, 60, 70,000 mile range is where you'll start to see, oh, there's a hose. Oh, replace that. Oh, there's another leaker there. Change that. Oh, a vent hose.
Oh, and all of a sudden at 70,000 miles, oh, there's a thermostat that just went. Oh, at 80,000 miles, my water pump just popped. So that's how it starts to evolve. Let's not forget about the oil and coolant leaks that come out from the oil filter housing. I personally had a turbo 6-cylinder BMW, and mine had all of those failures, leaking from both sets. Cheap parts, but costly labor. And then you have a plethora of oil leaks that you're going to experience through the life of this vehicle. For example, valve cover gasket, that's going to be a leaker. Failure of the Vano solenoids. We can't forget the water pumps and the high pressure fuel pump, because what we have is direct injected engine. So you're going to have carbon fouling, but you're also going to have a high pressure fuel pump. That's very expensive, and it's going to cost you big bucks. Faulty airbag module malfunction. And we won't even talk about the V8, which is the 50 series. It's even worse with high oil consumption. It's got turbo problems, timing chain issues, excessive battery draw, lots of issues with these X5s. It's the kind of vehicle, just when you thought you fixed those last 3 problems, that you wait another month and then there's a few more. The first car that I personally owned a couple years ago, but I couldn't get rid of it fast enough because it had so many engine problems. It leaked, it rattled, and it just went boom. And that was the E92 BMW 335, similar as we have right parked behind me here. Now, many people would argue that BMW 3 Series are the epitome of performance sedans and sport coupes. And they have more than their share of styling accents. The beautiful angel eye headlights and the typical kidney-shaped grille. They definitely have a nice front spoiler that always accentuates the look. Nice alloy wheels. And they have typical functional and slightly sporty mirrors on all of their cars. Nice handles that wear well and never break off on front and back. And cycle around. They always have that great trademark tail lights. You can't mistake them. It's a BMW. And this one here, how you tell it's an E90 335 is it's got the dual exhaust, similar as the one I had, but mine was the coupe. Look! Right there we have a car that has a 300 horsepower turbo 6-cylinder engine. Well, this is the revised updated N55 engine. Mine was the N54, which is the twin turbo 6-cylinder engine. Made lots of power, but I couldn't drive that piece of junk for more than a week without having to lift up the hood to make a coolant leak repair or possibly fix an oil leak, or of course there's a whole host of other problems. Let's talk about a few of the issues I had. My N54 had wastegate rattle. It was starting to rattle, and when that starts, you know the end is near. You're gonna have to do wastegates or turbos. High pressure fuel pump was known. Actually, BMW had an extended warranty out for that because it was such a junk original part. Then the high pressure injectors were a common failure. Then the infamous oil filter housing right here on this side. It leaked oil, coolant, or just mixed. Pretty extensive job to fix that because there was one bolt fastening that to the engine that you actually had to remove the bulkhead, cross bracing, and half of the intake manifold to get at. Then also intake manifold O-rings were a weakness here, and you get boost leak or vacuum leaks. And I also had a water pump thermostat, which is buried underneath. You have to pull down steering rack and other undercarriage components just to get at. And the parts weren't cheap either. I had to pay about $600 all in for the parts. That's through a wholesale network. Get the dealer to do it, that's a $2,000 repair for the water pump and thermostat. These cars leaked like a sieve. Sure, they were fun to drive because the way they were balanced, the manual gearbox, they looked nice, everything was decent except that damn engine. And I can only imagine if they put an equal amount of power into an electric motor under the hood, you wouldn't have all the leaks. You wouldn't have all the wastegate rattles and injector problems. You would just have a motor that just moved this thing down the road. And if you balance the weight appropriately, you could have a fun car that was a pocket rocket and exciting for years to come. The BMW 335, E90, and E92. What you're looking at behind me is beyond 5 years, but this is literally a museum piece. This is a showpiece. This is a car that rarely saw the road, and as a result, that's the only reason this older vehicle is still out there, because these were horrid, very unreliable. And unfortunately, GM used the Hummer branding from the H1 or the Humvee to spill down over into creation of this thing, which is called the H3, and is horrifically bad. That's why, just look around. When's the last time you've seen one of these Hummer H3s out on the road? This is literally the first one in ages that I've seen, and there's a good reason for that. They will not last 5 years, and there's a lot of problems. But let's take a quick look why anybody would even think about buying one of these in the first place. You can sort of see why people like these vehicles, obviously with the jacked up ride height, the illusion of great off-roading capability. We have beefy handles, makes it feel like very off-road capable. Step bars. Of course, you have the great front end, which looks very much like the H1, although this one's softened up a little bit from the original Humvee. Of course, you've got a very beefy front end, which tells you, hey, this is in fact a Hummer. Great extras there. And there you go with the H3 by GM. Other great little add-ons like these filler caps.
And of course, what we have here is a beautiful little cover for your extra spare wheel. Of course, you can haul your junk to the dump with that roof rack on top, but inside, look at those Glad garbage bag styled seats. Literally low grade, poor quality, and the rest of it looks like a Meccano set. These things are literal junk, and if you think you want to get in on a great GM off-roading capable type vehicle, this is not the vehicle. Skip. And I'll share with you what would be a great option. But one thing is there's lots of problems with the transmission, lots noted on RepairPal that would imply that these transmissions have hard shifting, juddery shifting, delayed, or absolute catastrophic failure, which means you're gonna spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, depending where you're located, for a new transmission or even a rebuild. Some of that could be the actual pressure control solenoid in the transmission, and that would cause the erratic shifting. And as well, the harsh and delayed shifting isn't unique for the Hummer, and sadly that's common for many GM product lines. There's also problems within the engine, camshaft or crankshaft sensor issues that can cause either no start, no run, poor run, rough idle. Gas cap filler as well spits out codes on the dash because of a loose gas cap filler. But the big fish why this thing will not last is because the engine. Read the forums, you're going to find lots of information, and I've spoke to people directly about this very issue where all of a sudden they developed a misfire. Cylinder 5 is a misfire, whatever. It becomes a problem, and then the engine just stops running smoothly. There are countless cases, I can't even tell you how many, where a GM actually had to replace these cylinder heads for these vehicles because there's always a problem in the top end of these engines. Oil consumption, rough idle, and catastrophic failure or cylinder misfire altogether usually means you're doing some major engine work that's transplanted under that hood. It's a sad state of affairs, and as a result, this vehicle will not make it 5 years unless you want to pour thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars down the chute just to keep this thing alive. But if you're looking for recommendations, you may have to spend a little more. Maybe look at an older Lexus GX 460 or a 470 if you've got a little extra bank available. They would be far better than this, and they actually have the infamous Toyota Land Cruiser baseline, and they're made for off-roading, and they're luxurious, and they will last virtually forever. The next engine that's horrible, you'll find in one of these. You'll find it in many other vehicles like Volkswagen Passats as well, but we're looking at the Audi A6, 97 to about 2005, and there's a series of turbo diesel engines, the 2.5 liter V6, lots of problems. Yeah, it had a lot of good performance, but it had a lot of negative attributes. And you could tell this older generation of Audi A6 just by simply looking at some of the headlights. You could tell that's the older generation, and this older generation here too. The grille, the headlights, clearly older style Audis. This one here has been rode hard, put away wet, and a little bit of crust around the edges. A vehicle that's seen some of its better days, but it's not about the exterior, it's not about the paint or the scratch or the rust or any of that. It's what you'll find in some of these vehicles like the Passat or this Audi A6, including the all-road, are some of the engine codes like AFB, AKN, AYN, BCZ, BDO, BFC, AKE, BAU, and BDH. That was a mouthful, but yes, you can also find them in Skodas. Like I said, within the VAG group, that engine was quite prevalent. Now, it had great performance, and it was actually quite economical, but there was an inherent issue, and some of it was contributory because the brand actually advised on extended oil service intervals, and that led to a catastrophic issue, which you'd find in a lot of these engines, preventing them from running all that long, and 50,000 miles would be a stretch, to say the least, which is ridiculous because most diesel engines are inherently designed and should be designed to run hundreds of thousands of miles, but not that one. One major issue that contributed to actually having to rebuild engines and them not lasting all that long are the camshafts would wear out way prematurely. The camshafts essentially are those that are connected to the ends of the valves and drive your valve train, allow fuel in, exhaust out, and those camshafts, the lobes would wear down, and then you'd find yourself with poor running conditions and situations where that vehicle just wouldn't run properly at all. Check engine lights and just a host of other issues. Other unfortunate problems with some of these are the thermostat that would actually plug off, and the thermostat's what opens and closes and allow the engine to evacuate heat or not, and sometimes the thermostat would jam up, you overheat that engine. Water pumps, another problem, they'd leak and they'd fail, as well as oil pumps. Turbochargers as well, a big problem. Turbochargers blow, you're dealing with a $3,000 or $4,000 repair. So whether it's turbos, water pumps, thermostats, even O2 sensors and leaks intake manifolds and like, there are way too many issues in that 2.5 liter turbo diesel engine,
even to assume that this thing will go any significant miles. The next engine, 4GR FSE V6. Yeah, that's the engine, actually what's tucked under that hood. And for those of you who don't necessarily recognize the nomenclature, let me spell that. I can make it a little simpler here for you. Every manufacturer, even the best, Toyota has a misstep once in a while. We know sudden acceleration, they had porous engines, they had little problems here and there, and this is one of those missteps. And this is a Lexus, which is clearly a Toyota product, but let's take a look and I'll explain some of the key issues that they've had here. It is a gorgeous looking car. Look, they do have that big mouth grille that they came out with. In this particular brand, you do have the check mark and beautiful wheels. This one's the F Sport, plain Jane little mirrors, simple touch access getting in, and of course there's no sunroof on this unit here. Beautiful tail lights as you circle around, and look, exhaust tips right there, all carboned up, and that's the point because this is an IS 250. Now don't beat me up too badly. I know a lot of people will say, oh, just use a catch can and do all these things and regular servicing and life's good. But the reality is that engine wasn't all that great. It was a bit of a misstep and Toyota quickly figured it out. Carbonization is the big one. They're sluggish, they're weak, and they're not necessarily built for longevity like you would expect from the other version, or the 3.5 liter V6 is clearly the engine you want. This is not. This is one that they just sort of missed the boat. Again, if you do extra maintenance above and beyond, you might get some miles out of it, but this car and this engine isn't necessarily built for the lifespan. Now, 50,000 miles might be a stretch. You can probably do some decent miles if you do the maintenance. If you totally neglect it, this car will fall apart. This car is the one that I have to use with a bit of a caveat if you do the maintenance. So it's a great car in general. Lexus, Toyota, almost unbeatable, but this is one of those little specks on the mark of the brand. And the next one on our list is a notorious beast. Yeah, it's a V6 and it's 3.6 liter, and unfortunately it was from a brand that has notoriously had issues galore. Now, what sort of vehicles can you find this engine in? Well, let's take a look. You find it in vehicles like this, CTS4 by Cadillac, XT6, XT5, SRX4 by Cadillac, and it's a 3.6 liter V6 found under that hood. But the reality is it belonged in way more than just Cadillacs. It was GM product through and through. So any kind of Chevy and GMC products as well, which decided to ante up to get that 3.6 liter V6, may have had a whole plethora of issues. Well, what kind of problems would you have with that engine? Well, water pump failures were a common issue, and of course if that goes, that cools your engine. Without it, your engine will go poof. As well, we had timing chains where they get loose. If a timing chain gets loose, you could wind up with skipping a cog and of course catastrophic engine failure. You could also get a camshaft actuator issue. Of course, camshafts operate the timing of your valves. If that's not operating properly, you'll get sluggish performance. Maybe it'll stall or won't run. The key is, of course, sloppy off the go, may not have the breathing up top when you need it, so you'll notice it's a drivability issue. Ignition coils, which are another issue which are attached to your spark plugs, may result in misfires and check engine lights, as well as heavy oil consumption. A lot of these engines just gobbled up the oil. And you could see a lot of that coming out of the tailpipe, whether it's obvious blue emissions or whether it's just that carbon in the pipes, or whether it's just me topping up oil every week, putting an extra extra quart of oil. They used oil like it was going out of style. So that 3.6 liter V6 clearly had some potential, but unfortunately there was way too many issues around that really doesn't inspire confidence. I mean, if you go back a few years, do you remember the 4.3 liter V6 by Chevy GM? That was a workhorse. That had gobs of torque, super reliable, revved out like crazy, and lasted hundreds of thousands of miles. You see them in all these Astra vans all over the place. You definitely don't see a lot of 3.6s lasting the type of miles that you got out of the 4.3. This is clearly not one for the quality books when you're expecting 220 visits per 100 vehicles and an average maintenance cost of about $800 a year, all in if you average out the big repairs. You could put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig. We have the 996. A lot of you who've been following the channel know that we bought this a while back, and I just want to talk about some of the things that I found out that you can find with problem areas with these vehicles. The 996 isn't necessarily flawless. There are issues that can creep up. There's a few little issues that we've got on our car, but more importantly, if you've been shopping for a 996, 911, and I do talk about what great value they are, and I still believe that is the case. In fact, there are some problem areas, and I want to talk about specific to some of the real problem, some of the problem areas that you would anticipate, or you should anticipate, and maybe inspect if you're taking out one of these for a test drive, or you may be thinking of buying one. You want to do a pre-purchase inspection, of course, is important. But specifically, let's just give you the rundown. I'm going to get right to the chase here. and what are some of the key problem areas you would anticipate in a 996 Porsche 911 like this. Let's just get right to it, everyone, because again, it's fun driving these great cars, but you just got to know what you're getting into. So let's really dive right in. So let's take this from the top. Let's go. So looking at the Porsche 911, they're great. I mean, it's a wear item. I mean, these cars are often driven very, very hard. A lot of people take them to the autocross or the racetrack. So there's some areas that you would expect premature wear. And it's not uncommon to actually have to fit brakes. I mean, you definitely want to check out the brakes. They're cross-drilled, ventilated. Not that brakes wear out any worse than any other cars. What you can have is premature wheel bearing problems. Wheel bearings are some of the issues you'll find with these. They start to squeak and howl, and it's actually quite common with a lot of these 996 generations, even more so than your garden variety vehicles. So keep an eye out for wheel bearing issues. One issue as well I want to show you that you will find. See, when you pull this, because this is a frameless window, as I pull the window or the door, you'll notice it drops just a hair like that. You'll see? Try that again. Pull the door handle and it drops, and then you open that up and Bob's your uncle. Well, sometimes they don't drop. And if they don't drop, that often means that there's a plethora of issues. Now there's a couple of micro switches tucked in here. And what that does is when you pull on the lever, the mechanism actually in there does create that window to drop, because if that window doesn't drop, it can bind up in here and grab and potentially shatter a window. So obviously that has to work. That's why that system operates the way it does. And if it's not working, I would start looking by the micro switches in the door. Possibly window regulator is another issue. That's very, very common. Micro switches galore. Lots of micro switch issues with some of these earlier generation 996s. So anticipate the worst, and often these dropping windows are a problem. Same with convertible roof issues, micro switches. You can anticipate some trouble areas in that. Another problem you would expect. Let's go in here. Pop that open. Now we're gonna check out the rear trunk space here. And it's a little dirty. I haven't yet to do a full proper detail on there, so disregard that. But basically, what you could expect are some issues here. I mean, you look in here, there's a series of hoses and knobs and, you know, all kinds of different fittings and materials and things. So where do you start and where do you end? Well, one of the common areas is this right here. This here is the expansion tank for your coolant. And that's basically where your extra coolant basically overflows. And so if you have a low level of coolant, or essentially not enough, then what that can mean is basically your engine can overheat. And if your engine overheats, it can cause a series of real catastrophic issues. So clearly you want to always make sure you have coolant in that overflow reservoir, that expansion tank, because that is a common issue. If you have a problem with that cracked, leaking, you could wind up with coolant leaking out the bottom down there, and you'll see often it down by the exhaust system down there behind that rear driver's side wheel. If this tank is leaking, if it's leaking, that's bad. Not just because it's the tank that's leaking, but it could mean you run out of fluid level, and then that's where things get really serious. So let's just talk about that. If, in fact, you run out of coolant, that's one of the common areas is the engine. So the liners, their cylinders can crack, break, deteriorate. Could actually mean a partial engine rebuild, because what ends up happening, it gets too hot, it overheats. And yeah, any car that overheats can suffer some catastrophic failure, but this is actually a well-documented, well-known issue of that crappy little expansion tank that can actually lead to a significant expense, and it's common. So don't neglect that. Make sure there's coolant in there and you're good to go. Another issue is the engine specifically. Of course, what are we looking at here? This is a 3.4 liter flat six, and basically the later generations are a 3.6 liter. Once you hit 2002 and above, or 2003 and above, sorry, you're basically into a 3.6. But that's not the issue. The 3.4 isn't necessarily an outlandishly unreliable engine. As a matter of fact, it's quite, well, if I can say bulletproof. But the problem is there's a couple issues within that engine. So we're looking at the back end of the engine right here. This here, you'll notice the pulleys at the front end. Well, if the pulleys at the front, at the back end, to your drive wheels, to the transmission or your transaxle right there, you have a seal on the output of that engine going to the gearbox, and that's basically your rear main seal. Close that up. And the rear main seal is a common issue. If the rear main seal dries up, because a lot of them do,
because a lot of these cars sit. People don't use them like they should be used. These are 911s. They're great. Use them, drive them, enjoy them. But a lot of people sit them too much and treat them like garage queens, and then that rear main seal leaks. So then what that means is you wind up with an oil leak somewhere at that end of the engine, and you'll find it way up kind of around below between the sets of wheels, essentially. Basically where the engine and the gearbox match up, that's essentially in the clutch area. You'll wind up with oil leaking down. That's your rear main seal. Very common problem with a lot of these vehicles. So definitely keep an eye out for those oil leaks at the front of the engine, I'll say at the back of the engine, but further towards the front of the car. So keep an eye out for that. That's a common issue. And before we move on to one of the biggest, ugliest common problems you'll find with a 996 like this, is let's go inside first, take a look at some of the nickel and dime issues. So open that up and we'll look in here. So you'll see there's lots of little buttons and knobs. You got electrics here, and you got a series of electronic controls down there. You have your HVAC controls. You have all these little buttons here. You have the roof control. You have a defrost, and of course you have your locking system there. Look over here and you have other controls and knobs and buttons depending on the amount of options you have. Of course, down here we have your power windows, rear windows, and front windows right there. So there's lots of options and features and electrics like every modern day vehicle these days. And again, this generation is particularly bad for electrics. There's poor micro switches, bad electrics, and it's not uncommon to have some nickel and dime electric switch or problem or relay. So definitely what I would suggest, if you're gonna buy one of these, go through every control. Please don't skip that. Don't think, it's working, it's fine. I've heard of issues with even the horn not functioning, and I'll show you that actually before we get to this. Let's look. Pop this open. Now I've heard of cases where a horn actually works when the vehicle's parked like this and the ignition's turned off. But I've heard of people, they put the key in the ignition, turn it on, and the car's idling and running, but now all of a sudden the horn doesn't work. Even if you press it really, really hard, it just doesn't work. Well, what's going on with that? Well, there's a bunch of wiring, and some people say it has to do with some wiring in the actual steering column, and when the car's turned off, it still bridges power from somewhere else through a back door, through the wiring scheme, and that answers the question why it'll work when the car is off, but it may not work when the car is running, because then it goes through the normal route, typically through your ignition switch, to illuminate all the controls in your actual steering wheel. And so that's one of the key areas. Make sure, check your horn when the car is off, when the car is on. Check all your electrics, your buttons, your lights, your switches. Check every single button and knob. And sometimes you'll find that there's some issues along the way, because remember, it's a Porsche and there's nothing cheap about driving a Porsche. You think, a little switch or a light doesn't work. When you really dig in, a lot of times it's more than just a switch or a light, and it ends up being some module or some really expensive repair, or very labor intensive to repair as well. So that's one thing that I've learned about some of these generation 911s. Some of the electrics aren't necessarily the most robust, so be sure to go through it from top to bottom, left to right. Sunroof, make sure it's opening and closing smoothly and quietly. This is a convertible roof. Definitely make sure the roof is working well, up and down, no big noises, no big shakes and rattles, and it does it consistently a few times. Then that's going to help you build some confidence that you've got yourself a solid car. And so I can't ignore the last big one. There's a big problem that a lot of these cars have. The 996, it's the intermediate shaft bearing problems. Now, the intermediate shaft, they said back in 97 to about 99, there was an issue with the seals drying up. Now, the intermediate shaft is a shaft that basically connects the drive, the crankshaft output runs through to the camshaft. And then there's a bearing that it runs through. And that bearing is essentially like a ball bearing, okay? Like a lot of bearings you'll find almost like a glorified wheel bearing. But the problem with that is totally redesigned. The older 911s had a different type of bearing configuration. They still had an intermediate shaft, but a different configuration. Now in this next generation, the M96, they came up with this ball bearing design. It was a sealed bearing, and realistically, if that bearing dried up, basically you'd have yourself a catastrophic failure, because that bearing would seize up. You'd wind up with all this particulate within the engine, and it usually meant that you had to strip the engine completely down its entirety, clean it out, basically remove all the debris, run oil through it, clean it, freshen it up, put all the new parts back together and replace the collateral damage. Or a lot of people would just drop a whole brand new engine in, just because it often saves a lot of time. But regardless, it ends up costing money out of your pocket just to get that
unfortunately at an intermediate shaft, which is like a $20 bearing. Realistically, it's not a pricey bearing to get that fixed. And sadly enough, it can cause you a lot of collateral damage and a lot of potential heartache. So definitely want to keep an eye on that. And that's one of the big issues.
Now, unfortunately, the IMS bearing, of course, in 2001 roughly to 2005, they revised it, or about 2000 to 2005, they revised it. They said they upgraded it, and it was actually, they claimed it to be better. But in actuality, what they were finding was they actually had almost suffered even more failures. So it really wasn't until after 2005 that they had a better factory provided bearing. So if you bought, say, a 2007 or 2008 911, you probably had yourself a 911 with that generation of engine, and you're into the 997 car as well, and you probably had yourself a situation where you had something a little more reliable. Not perfect, but more reliable. And other than that, the only other way to get around that was upgrades that you can provide. You can get yourself an oil fed system, which provides oiling through the bearing at all times. It takes oil from the system, flushes it through, keeps oil in there, or the upgraded, essentially a ceramic type bearing that you can get from a lot of aftermarket providers.
So I hope that helps everybody. You know what? Remember, life is too short to drive boring cars. And you know, every fun car always has some little glitch, some little gremlin. You name me a car that really doesn't have something that maybe you have to deal with. This Porsche 911 is no different. There are some issues you got to contend with, but I want to bring to light, in case you've been shopping for 996, there's some key areas you should be aware of. Other than that, some good old-fashioned maintenance should keep the car in tip-top shape.
And the next one on the list is this horrifyingly spaceship-looking unit right here, and we're talking about a Dodge Grand Caravan. So first of all, it looks terrible. It looks like it's ready to launch off to space, and that's rightfully so, because they pretty much gave it the send-off, sayonara. And yeah, while these do look like your typical Palm Springs rental vehicle that you find loaded up at the airport, this is in fact just that, throwaway. Easy to chuck people in and out, not worried from the rental car company how people use them and abuse them, because they won't last very long anyhow. These vehicles come with the 3.6 liter Pentastar V6, and of course they have a 6-speed automatic transmission, both of which are quite outdated, the technology outdated, as well as the electronics don't even work all that well in these vehicles. I mean, just look at it. Yeah, you get basic wheels, small brakes, old school headlights. These types of headlights were made back in 2001 on this little Chrysler product here. I've got these big sliding doors here, and old school basic mirrors, and simpleton little handles. Of course, they even have this weird and awkward looking tail end here. Take a look around. Look at this thing. This is weird. I can't make out whether I want to puke, laugh, or just cry when I see this. I mean, look at the tail lights here. How about this little rounded off piece? I don't know what Dodge was thinking when they made this piece. Of course, this is the Grand Caravan, as we say, little simple handles. Of course, a little mirror, and naturally the logo from hell. Here as we scroll down, fit and finish issues there. Of course, more is simpleton handles. What's inside too? Feels like you're sitting in a bathhouse. There's a lot of plastic in here for sure, and it looks like my fishing tackle box. These engines were never the epitome of high quality and long lasting. You could pretty much expect oil consumption, but what we can see is oil leaks, coolant leaks, and those are big issues. We also can't help but notice that we have TIPM issues, so the totally integrated power module, which you can see that problem time and time again. And what that is commonly afflicting a lot of Jeep and Dodge products. And that's all your electrics all come into one major brain, one major module. If that module fails, that usually means you're out several $1,000s just to get it retrofitted. That is a sad state of affairs. So the overall quality, reliability is really all up there with the Fiat products. Not great.
What we're looking at here is the Ford Bronco. A lot of people have wanted to get their hands on these. Very utilitarian. It's a throwback to the old school days. Of course, some great elements. You've got tow hooks there, and you've got that strong Bronco front grille. Of course, right here you've got some tie downs and some big, beautiful off-road wheels. This one's a black diamond edition. Look, sturdy. You've also got this beautiful roof here and some very solid looking handles. The interior looks pretty robust as well, although if not slightly dressed down and not all that high quality. But it's a great looking unit with all the versatility, ruggedness. The intention is to compete with something from the Jeep arsenal. It definitely has the look from the 70s, but unfortunately the engine buried under that hood is not the same level of reliability as some of the old school engines. Now unfortunately we're talking about the 2.7 liter EcoBoost engine that you're finding under the hood there. Now the real problem there is it's been recalled because of
some valves dropping. The valves are breaking because apparently the valves don't stay in place. The keepers let them go, and then you end up with a piston and valve collision, catastrophically ruining that engine. The worst part is,
A lot of these are letting go at relatively low miles, so they're finding out pretty quickly what the issue is if you do in fact have an issue. Very, very problematic engine and a sad state of affairs in today's current day and age.
but there's other issues. If you happen to have the 2.3 liter, there's wastegate issues. Some of these vehicles also have problems with water leaks, roof squeak and rattles, and the overall quality control isn't exactly as many people hoped it would be. Sadly, the 2.7 liter EcoBoost engine,
Not really a good engine by today's standards. Here's an X SUV that kind of looks almost like a minivan, but it also has problems, engine problems. Quite a few of them reported. Specifically, 2011 to 2017 model years are where the real hot spots were.
why are people buying these? I mean, they do look almost like a minivan. They technically qualify them as an SUV.
They got some actually cool wheels, some cool little handles, of course, and the interior is actually very marginal. Not quite up to luxury car standards, but it's equipped with leather. Of course, you have lots of great glass on top and some cool mirrors that are fold away. What about the front end? Projector headlamps, and look, we're talking about a Kia right there. What is this cool conglomeration? And look down the side, it's a very basic looking design overall. And look around the back, beautiful little taillights on this SX GDI, and it's a Sorrento. Now I know they're very popular vehicles, a lot of people buy these, and there's a lot of them out on the road. And a lot of people have been very happy with their results, but there have been a lot of very unhappy customers, unfortunately, related to the engine that's under the hood, with some of the V6s in that certain generation, as I mentioned already.
And what can actually happen is the head gasket, where it can start leaking externally or internally into the engine, where he starts consuming the coolant. And that, of course, then starts taking a toll to the internals of the engine, and you'll start seeing white smoke potentially coming out of the exhaust system. Often, a lot of these cars start to fail between 50 and 80,000 miles. And when you have to fix that engine problem,
Because often it's out of warranty, it ends up costing you anywhere from $5,000 to $7,000, $8,000 to actually fix that problem. Very expensive to actually rectify that sad state of affairs.
but it doesn't just end there. There's other issues too. We can get a chain slap on startup. You get the timing chain can go brrr. You can get a crankshaft pulley bolts on some of the earlier ones where they'd back off. And if the crankshaft is coming loose, you're gonna have a major catastrophic failure. There's also headlights that prematurely burnt out, door handles that would stop working, air conditioning that would stop pumping the cold air.
So unfortunately, it's another one for the dumpster.
If you're liking the video so far, you're gonna love the rest of the channel. Be sure to hit that subscribe button down below, and don't forget the notifications bell so you know when the next amazing videos come. The next one is turbocharged engines. Now, a lot of this is a little overlap, but ultimately turbocharging has brought performance, fuel economy, efficiency, but it's also brought expensive maintenance and repairs. And there's many turbocharged engines today that simply won't last, because once some of these OEMs started using turbocharging, they started realizing drastic failures. Properly designed turbocharged engine can last a lot of years, but as they found out in some of these Mercedes-Benz, some of the older V6s lasted way longer than some of the newer turbocharged four-cylinder engines, and many of these are built and developed by outside third-party groups. Even Peugeot and some of the other manufacturers are getting involved in some of the mainstreams here, and unfortunately some of these changes have impacted overall durability. Let's get right into some of these turbocharged engines that simply won't last.
And another disaster here for engines is what's under this hood. And I know two people who actually personally own them, one personal friend and as well as a friend of the family. And I know mechanics that have stuck working on these vehicles. Now, when they're working well, they're great. But these engines aren't really built for longevity. They're not built to get a lot of hard miles out of them and a lot of hard use. They just won't last. They won't tolerate it. And aside from what this is, clearly we're talking about a Volkswagen. And this is even what the birds are thinking about them. Yeah, they have great wheels and look, nice fold-away mirrors. Look at that single touch access in, and look, we got a sunroof on top with roof racks. Of course, here we have the V-dub, flips up, gives you the rear view mirror, and this is the 4Motion. Of course, beautiful taillights. This feels actually like an Audi product here for sure, no doubt about it. Now the interior is quite dialed in too, and it's a very nice looking vehicle. The engine we're describing is the DKFA 7 Turbo. Yeah, that's a 2.0.
But aside from the engine specifically, there's infotainment related issues, there's issues with the lighting that aren't functioning properly, the emergency braking system that doesn't quite dial in properly. There's lots of little nickel and dime troubles here with this vehicle, meaning it's a question whether the whole vehicle will even make it 60,000 miles, never mind just the engine alone, but the engine has some problems of its own. For example, throttle body problems. Throttle bodies aren't working right, you don't get a nice idle, the vehicle doesn't run properly, it's sluggish off the start, it surges and hunts, so throttle bodies are a problem. Also, carbon deposits in there means you're gonna have to do regular maintenance on the intake to clean all of that up. Another big problem. Another issue is touching the gas and it hesitates. It just hesitates to go. Doesn't give you the go power when you need it. Also, another big issue, one of the big ones, is related to timing chains. Right, these vehicles have timing chain issues, and when you lose a timing chain coordination between the pistons and valves, that's actually what keeps it all in sync. What do you think's gonna happen? Boom! Well, really, boom really only comes from an interference engine. That's when you actually have overlap between piston and valve. Non-interference engine just means it'll get rattly, it'll go out of sync, it won't run right, it'll make noise, you get a check engine light, and the vehicle will stop working. And it all has to do with the tensioners. The plastics in there, you get the guides, the ramps, the tensioners, and they get weak, and the vehicle just won't run right. And it means thousands of dollars out of your hard-earned wallet to actually keep that vehicle on the road. Now, sadly, that engine, great performer when it's brand new, but it's not one for the lifespan, and it likely won't make over 60,000 miles.
The next beauty on our list here definitely is one of those that can deceive you. Now, they're great to drive and they're wonderful cars, and honestly, if you get past some of the typical nuances, you could find yourself with a decent car. The problem is there are some reliability issues related to that engine, and because it's turbocharged and it's 4-cylinder and it's Jaguar, the trust just isn't there for long life for a 2-liter turbo 4 by the brand. So unfortunately, we're dealing with this beautiful car by Jaguar. It has these great headlights, as you can see there. And yes, it has this beautiful design here. And yeah, the fold-away mirror is pretty common even for the F-Type. Here you do have this oversized glass roof on top, the little shark's tail there, and you do have this great little wing on the back. It looks beautiful. And this is the XE, as I already mentioned, with the LED taillights. Unfortunately, Jaguar ranges 29 out of 32 in terms of reliability, so it's almost dead last. RepairPal also quotes it as being rated only 2.5 out of 5 star for overall reliability, which means even from a mechanic standpoint and logging thousands of these vehicles and their issues across the nation, they're finding that you're only getting mediocre reliability at best. Some of the issues are related to fuel systems, and that's where it really gets ugly. The fuel rails have been known to leak, drivability issues with that. Of course, there's other issues with the electronics, infotainment, sunroof problems. It isn't the most unreliable vehicle, it's just that it feels a little fragile, and problems that take it down really shouldn't exist, and that's just the way it works. You can expect 229 failures unexpectedly out of 100 vehicles. That's right, almost 2.5 times per vehicle you would expect to go into the dealership and have to dole out your hard-earned dollars. On top of that, you could actually, in a 10-year time frame, if they lasted that long, expect to pay up to about $10,000 or $12,000 in that time just for basic maintenance and the odd repair that pops up in between time. So it's going to be a pricey car to own and operate. Unfortunately, I don't know if durability is logged into that vehicle, and I would say use your own best judgment. And the next engine catastrophe is what's buried under the hood of one of these vehicles. Right there, or right there, right there, and there, that one. As well as the Volkswagen CC and many other vehicles that use the EA 888. That's right, it's a popular 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder engine that Volkswagen used through a whole plethora of different cars and little SUVs. Now, while it performs well, you would almost expect a major catastrophic failure in 1 out of 50 vehicles, which is way too many. It's literally Russian roulette or rolling of the dice. But I can still see the allure why people buy Volkswagens. I mean, it's a classic name. It's the Volkswagen, the people's car. Great headlights, great little chin spoilers and vents, beautiful wheels. Of course, this one we're looking at the Golf R right here, as well has a beautiful high gloss piano finish. Great little detail along the side. Of course, LED tail lights are a great feature as well. And down below you have a set of quad tailpipes because this is the R. Now, it's a very practical, purposeful little car. Lots of performance, lots of efficiency, and as well as the interior,
is very well stapled together. You can get a manual or a DSG transmission, and it makes for a very, very fun driving experience. And that pretty much goes for virtually every Volkswagen. They have a feel of solid, like a tank, like a vault. Their materials are nice. And the reference of German engineering always fits in there, and of course makes people feel like they're buying something sturdy and well built. Now, generally speaking, I would say that's fairly true and accurate. However, there's lots of problems with this specific engine. You want a few? I mean, it's not hard to trace back some of these issues from 2006 all the way to more or less the present. Misfires, check engine lights, spark plugs, and the coils, of course. Now, that's a lot of maintenance items, but it's still costly when you're talking about coil packs and digging into the German parts bin, similar to the ones that are used by Audi. It means that maintenance on this engine is going to be quite pricey as well. Now, of course, with a lot of these German cars nowadays, they're using similar technology, snap fittings, plastic hoses, and as a result, you're getting coolant leaks. It's very popular with a lot of these vehicles. Oil leaks can be prevalent as well. Thermostat leaks, as well as water pump leaks, is a big issue with a lot of these cars. Now, because this vehicle is direct injected and they're spraying the fuel directly into the cylinder, means the back of the intake valves don't necessarily get a wash like the old conventional engines. And as a result, carbon fouling is very, very common with these vehicles. As I showed you on the tailpipe, carbon is this car's middle name. Now, a lot of that stuff's replaceable. Some would even argue that a lot of it's maintenance. Now, what's not necessarily maintenance is an unpredicted stretch timing chain that results in a catastrophic failure or an engine that just dies on the spot. Now, it doesn't really matter what kind of German car you're talking about. Even a base model like this can still cost you $8,000 to $10,000 for a replacement engine. Step it up into an Audi and you could be dealing with a $15,000 to $20,000 repair bill. So engine replacement can be very extensive, expensive, as well as undesirable. And next we have this gorgeous, beautiful Mercedes C300 Coupe. It's got the actual 2-liter turbo 4-cylinder engine, makes about 242 horsepower and made it up to a 9-speed auto. What's not to love with it? You actually have the 4MATIC, so it's the all-wheel drive system. Gorgeous headlights on there. Of course, you have that big bold grille with the 3-pointed star. Lots of great accents on the front. Beautiful wheels. Of course, we have this wonderful mirror right here as well, and massive glass on top to allow a lot of light into the cabin for these happy passengers right here. Of course, you have little great details there and a set of wonderful exhaust tips that you can find on there. Again, backup camera tucked in behind that 3-pointed star and an LED set of taillights that are gorgeous. The downside is it's the engine in this car. It's called the M274. And again, as I mentioned, it puts out a lot of performance. There's been about 13 recalls related to this vehicle, and about 220 times will 100 vehicles actually make it into the dealership for unexpected repairs. As a matter of fact, we own one of these. We also started developing some front-end noise on our vehicle, and that clearly is something that's well documented on the net. But we're talking about the engine. Will that engine last? I'm not sure. I mean, the engine sounds a little rattly on cold startups. That's pretty typical, but that's not unlike a lot of 4-cylinder engines. What is unfortunate is to own one of these in a 10-year time frame is $15,986 if you rotate the A and B rotation services as well as unexpected repairs along the way. You're expecting almost $1,500 a year when you spread out the big repairs with the small maintenance bits. But the reason this one doesn't seem to fare so well is recently there's been some alleged class action lawsuits related to hold pistons. In other words, engines catastrophically failing as a result of a piston winding up with a hole in it and then basically shooting oil at the back end, resulting in a huge engine replacement, maybe $15,000 to $20,000 just to get that sorted out. And a lot of that has to do with the simple fact that you're saying the EGR system, it also has to do possibly with poor fuel. And if people aren't using the proper grade of fueling in here, it could create a situation of detonation, pre-ignition in other words, which can essentially, it's like taking a ball peen hammer and hammering the piston top to the point where it starts blowing out. And if it blows out, it's gone. So unfortunately, I can't say the M274 is an engine that's going to last 300,000 miles. I don't see it. And unfortunately, I don't have the trust that it will. The next SUV with major engine problems is what's parked right here. Yeah, it pains me to say that because typically Honda is a ruthlessly reliable brand. Of course, they're known for fuel efficiency, reliability, low cost of maintenance and servicing. They're ruthless, they're great. But there is a problem with this specific SUV and the engine that's tucked under the hood of that vehicle. But let's take a quick look. Beautiful wheels, got this great little plastic guard along the base, protected from stones and rock. Of course, nice little handles there, great mirrors, and the interior is sharp too. Very rugged, robust, and will wear extremely well. You also get a sunroof on top. And around the back, you have some great little taillights on this CR-V by Honda.
So what could possibly be the problem with driving a Honda SUV, such as this little CR-V right here? Well, there's one specific engine that's a real problem, and you need to know about it. It's the L15B7 engine. It's a turbo 1.5 liter 4-cylinder engine that you typically find in a lot of these vehicles. Now, it's not unique to the CR-V. There's some cars that use that engine as well. And there's a whole host of issues with that engine. If I didn't know better, I think this was actually powered by BMW. Just kidding. One common issue is carbon buildup. Because it's direct injected engine, you can get excessive amounts in and around the valves, the intake manifold, and eventually you just need to maintain that, tear it all down and clean it all out. Misfires is another one. If you get the wrong specification of a spark plug in the really cold weather, it may not properly run. You could get misfires, check engine lights. But the big issue with this engine is oil dilution. That's right. Because it is direct injected and the way it's been designed, what's end up happening is you're getting too much pressure in the fuel system. It's pushing past the rings and it's winding with fuel in the base of the engine. That's right, it's mixing oil and fuel together. Don't think that's a problem? Think again. Remember, what is fuel? It's essentially a type of solvent. Solvent and oil, they use solvents to break down oil if you're using it to clean, for example. So you mix too much fuel with oil, it starts to reduce its protective abilities to keep the engine in one piece. For example, rod bearings, cam lobes, all those parts that need lubrication and oil to function properly and keep everything lubed is potentially in jeopardy. And how do you know that's going to be a problem? Well, check your oil level frequently. If you start to see it rise, that's a surefire indication that you actually are putting fuel into the engine oil sump. Now, there's a couple of things Honda's been working on some software updates to get that sorted out. And as well, make sure the best thing you can do is give the vehicle a proper warm-up time when you're driving it. Make sure the engine's really warm before you really get on the throttle. Otherwise, you can force that fuel past the rings and have more of this oil dilution. The other thing you can do is make sure that you're doing enough oil services. That's right, step it up. Do more oil services than even Honda would recommend. Because the more you change that oil, even if you're diluting the oil, there's less chance of it causing some serious issues.
And right there is where many 3-cylinder engines actually belong. Many of them now with turbocharged drivetrains mean that they're working extremely hard. Even some of the older 3-cylinder engines and rough running, the fuel economy really isn't that much better than anything 4-cylinder, and yet they're working twice as hard. 3-cylinder engines are pretty much throwaway, almost like your old cell phone from 1989, you know, the old brick phone. They're not built to last. I'm going to get into a list of some of the worst 3-cylinder engines you could possibly dream up. Ford, GM, yeah, let's get into it.
So viewer Kenny B actually reaches out and says the engine package in these popular little sporty subcompact SUVs are a troublesome little sort. And what we're dealing with here is clearly it's the little blue oval right here. As we can see, it's from Ford, and look, it's an EcoBoost 4-wheel drive. And yes, it's the Escape right there. But let's take a quick look around and we'll talk about some of these engine issues. Very stylish looking unit. Obviously has these Pep Boy looking units there. Of course, alloy wheels, beautiful front headlights, and of course, the big oval right there pointing in the screen. But what do you have other than transmission issues and other big electronic troubles? You actually have engine troubles galore. And according to vehiclehistory.com, there's a whole plethora of issues that you can experience. Potentially, a lot of them have to do with coolant. Many issues exist with this particular 1.5 or 2-liter EcoBoost engine. Some of them related to coolant leaks, sudden loss of power, vehicle rollaways, and even NHTSA has addressed concerns with brake fluid and faulty airbag systems. Now specifically, we're dealing with engines from 2013 to 2019 where we have coolant issues migrating into the engine. Well, what's that all about? Well, allegedly on these engines, coolant often leaks down into the cylinders. And when that happens, they end up burning coolant. Sometimes it means coolant, white smoke coming out of the exhaust tips, which could result in overheating, failing, consumption of coolant, and as well, potential for catching fire. Another engine fire potential right here, just looming to happen. And drivers often notice that this cylinder head was cracked, which was one of the contributing factors. Poor quality as well as the thin sidewalls on the combustion chamber. And depending on the severity of the failures, $1,000 might be the card, or even up to $6,000 or $7,000 if you're having to do a full motor job. So it's not a cheap repair, and most of them have failed catastrophically well before 70 or 80,000 miles.
putting them at that 60,000 mile range is a stretch. And we have another Ford Sputnik right here. Has some of the worst drivetrain technology mustered up into one vehicle. Yes, we're talking about the Ford EcoSport, or EcoTurd for short, but what it has is a 1-liter engine. Weak, catastrophic dumpster fire on wheels. Well, the main problem is it's got a wet belt. It is susceptible to fractures, and you could lose power steering, power brakes, and the engine could go poof. The worst part is with the wet timing belt, it actually prevents the timing from maintaining correct synchronization, and you could have piston and valve problems. On top of it, have you ever heard an oil pump that wasn't driven by gears? That's right, almost every vehicle that you see on the lot anywhere at any time is driven by a type of gear train that actually is built of steel gears, and they were forcing the oil to all the parts that need lubrication. The bottom end, the rod bearings, the top end, the cam lobes, all those areas that need oil are driven by the oil pump. Ford, in all their infinite wisdom, in their 1-liter EcoSport engine, had to go and use something a little different. Yes, they actually used a belt-driven oil pump, which is susceptible to failure, and when it does at 60 or 70,000 miles, boom, and the engine is gone. Basically, transmission, engine failures, but that 1-liter turbo engine by Ford EcoSport is a literal disaster, and don't walk away, run away. And so viewer Greta offers up another one. And clearly we have a Chevy product, and this is a Trax. Yes, oh, it has a little trailer hitch, but I wouldn't dare trailering anything with this. You'll blow the engine for sure. Yeah, it has little alloy wheels and plastic shrouding and cutesy little mirrors, and yeah, a little trailer trash rack on top. But here you have fake plastic, more fake plastic, more fake plastic. It doesn't just begin and end with the Chevy Trax. It's also the Cruze, it's also the Buick Encore, as well as the little Chevy Sonic that share the 1.4-liter Ecotec turbocharged dumpster fire of an engine. But that engine under that hood is where you can get into a lot of trouble. There's a lot of problems. The biggest problem is you can't even get a replacement engine until probably in 2024. They're backlogged, they're back ordered, and if you actually happen to blow an engine on this, you're gonna have to wait. What sort of engines would you anticipate with this little unit? How about oil burning? Is that bad enough? Nobody likes an oil burning engine. How about turbocharged failures, as well as other internal engine catastrophes? We can't forget the piston rings and holdout pistons are another one through the detonation and blowing a hole, thus resulting in a catastrophic engine. Boom! Oh, and that is all it. All over, but the crying car wizard confirms that. Yes, in fact, I too know of several mechanics that have dealt with these vehicles, and that Ecotec engine is just one for the dumpster. Unfortunately, it's one that won't make 60,000 miles. And the next one is this little warhorse right here. It looks like a silver bullet, doesn't it? Yeah, well, it's not quite the silver bullet now, is it? We're talking about the Ford Escape, but there's a whole bunch of other vehicles that use the same engine. It's actually the engine that's under the hood, 1.5 liter, 1.6 liter, and the 2-liter EcoBoost engines. They have a bunch of problems, and personally, I'd pass on that. The funny part is, a lot of people will say, well, yeah, fix that known issue, and then that engine's bulletproof. Well, that's the same as Kia and Hyundai saying, yeah, Kia and Hyundai will replace that engine free of charge, and then you've got a brand new engine. It's still a problem. It's a bad design, and you've got engines that are failing. What's going on here are the heads are overheating. But before we get into the problem, let's take a quick look around so maybe you can identify with this vehicle and ask yourself, do you really need to have that, or should I keep looking? Here we have the Ford. Pretty basic blasé design and a basic set of headlights. Cute little rims though, and that little accent there. Oh, look at that mirror 3-way, and of course pretty standard handles. Whoa, look at those tail lights on this Escape. And it's a Ford, and SE, and as I said, EcoBoost all-wheel drive. Not much going on the top, but you've got all this plastic shrouding to protect the bodywork from the rocks. But what about the inside? What does that look like? There. It's another one of those interiors that looks like a giant plastic recycling facility. But clearly it's a no-frills vehicle. You don't have sunroof or roof racks. Very basic vehicle. It's meant to be economical, but it's problematic if the engine goes boom on you. That can be an issue. And that's what's going on. Allegedly, there's a situation where coolant is leaking out of the engine. There's no sense of detection on that, and the heads are overheating, thus causing engine damage. Often it happens way before anybody even figures it out, and by the time it becomes obvious, it's too little too late. So if you've been shopping for an EcoBoost engine with a 1.5, 1.6, or a 2-liter, be sure to do your homework. And so viewer D9R actually asked the question, what about the RX-8? What kind of engine's in there, and does that have engine problems? Right here, we have a Mazda RX-8, and in fact it does. It has a twin rotor, multi-port fuel injection called a 13B Renesis engine. Yeah, it's a twin rotor engine. It has these two 3-sided rotors that spin out of sync, and of course they have these little seals. They call them the apex seals, and those are common known issues. Now, the Mazdas have always created a very unique effect with some of those RX-7s and RX-8s. I personally owned an 88 Mac in the day, and they rev to the moon. They're fun to drive. They whistle along like a vacuum cleaner, and if you pull the rev limiter, you can get up to 17, 18,000 RPM without them blowing a gasket. However, these ones are not quite the same level of durability, and there's problems with that Renesis engine. Of course, you don't see these many around anymore because they don't last all that long. It's beautiful. There's the old Mazda logo. Of course, they have these beautiful high beams right there blasting away, and a pretty interesting front grille. I love these fender flares that you'll find on here, and they have that little grille and a tiny little mirrors. How about those suicide doors that flip this way instead of that way? Of course, look at that, gas cap, quite nice, and an aftermarket looking style of taillights here on this Mazda RX-8 right here. It's a beautiful looking car, and it's too bad that they didn't extend and further develop this chassis and design with a better engine. Yeah, you have sunroof there, and you have a pretty cool interior with a manual gearbox, which is a dying breed these days, but it's that Renesis engine which is going to eat your lunch. So what kind of problems would you expect? Extended warranty insurance companies have gone out and said that this engine has far exceeded almost any other engine on the market for lacking reliability and the fact that you have to replace it. 60,000 miles is a stretch. Good luck you even trying to get there with one of these engines. Yeah, you can get other issues like catalytic converter failures, which plug off and reduce that back pressure or increase the back pressure so the engine won't start properly. Starter issues you can anticipate as well. Power steering problems, not directly engine, but lots of issues with that, as well as the shifter knobs. But ignition coils are one of the big problems. You'll eat those like lunch. The engine floods very easily as well, partially because it may not get ignition or spark properly, and then it winds up just flooding the engine, pouring out and washing away the cylinder compression spaces. Those infamous apex seals already mentioned, they wear out way too prematurely. And once they wear out, then you reduce the compression, you start washing the cylinders, and it becomes a vicious cycle of catastrophes, one leading to the next, and it just cascades from there. The simple fact is, the Renesis engine does not last over 60,000 miles, and good luck if you get one that does. Wow, you're a better guy than me. Twin rotor 13B Renesis engine, for the loss.
When most people dream and fantasize about Italian cars, they think Ferrari, Lamborghini, maybe Maserati, but they forgot about brands like this. What are we talking about here? One that definitely won't make 100,000 miles. I guarantee you won't find them. Look in the classifieds. It's also not well supported in the North American market. Nobody seems to really want these. There's not a lot of them on the road. It never really quite caught on. And while there's a hotter version, the Abarth is actually fun. That's an enthusiast car. What we have here is a smaller subspecimen, if you will, of the species. It's not a particularly great unit, but let's take a quick look around here. Clearly, it's a small Italian car made by Fiat. Of course, here they've got the little bug eyes, very similar in stature to the Mini, as well as even the Smart car. So in Europe, obviously, this generation works because with diesel engines and manual gearboxes, it's just cheap to run and easy. But in the North American market, everybody wants automatics. And so the automatic transmissions aren't good. Even the manual gearboxes aren't that solid, but it's the gas engines here that just really are a disaster. I mean, the quality of materials isn't great. Look inside. The materials just generally don't wear all that well. You've got scuffing and plastics that wear out, leather that just doesn't hold up, and the fabric is weak. But it's not interior materials that prevent a vehicle from lasting. It's everything else that this thing provides. For example, weak gearboxes are known to blow out. Suspension issues. Yeah, you can get the wobbly, you can actually get clunking and banging. The suspension is very fragile, built in a very lightweight fashion. We also have coolant leaks, oil leaks, and the worst of all, blown head gaskets is a common phenomenon with these cars. And when you start blowing engines up, you're talking $3,000 to $5,000, $7,000 to refurbish an engine. When the gearbox goes, which isn't uncommon either, that's another few grand. Then you start having to refurb some of the other issues, like some of the brake issues, as well as some of the suspension problems, which these are well known for, power steering issues, overheating problems, and generally just a weak design means this vehicle won't last very long. To say 100,000 miles is an extreme stretch. I haven't seen personally any that have made that number. If you see one, I'd love to hear about it. But clearly, as cute and fresh as it looks, it's definitely not one of those vehicles that's meant to last.
Now, M's version of the V10 in this big, beautiful, bold BMW M5 that I have parked in my garage. I love this car, so it's a love-hate relationship with any of these V10 cars. V10 engines have the potential to put out some of the best sounds. Think of what you see in the Carrera GT and the Porsche or the Lexus LFA, and even the Dodge Viper creates a large displacement V10. Many of those are actually relatively reliable. The BMW's V10, albeit it's an F1 derived and designed and inspired engine, unfortunately doesn't have the staying power for longevity. What do you get with these kind of engines? One of the best driving engines with some of the best sounds, high revving, has an incredibly high top speed, but it comes with a very short lifespan. Let's talk about one of the worst V10 engines on the market for overall longevity. Right here we have the BMW M5, as we're looking at right here. It's a beautiful unit, and I truly believe the E60 M5 is one of the most beautiful and gloriously designed M5s and certainly V10 engines on the market ever. But if you look at the drivetrain underneath the hood, it is packaged in such a way that almost every little minor repair or maintenance needs to have an engine out service or dropping the parts. But the problem is you have a variety of issues. We've had problems with the throttle actuators. You have to remove part of the intake, the throttle actuators. You're talking about thousands of dollars. There's a couple of them in there and they're not built to last. They have these little plastic gears. When they wipe out, a couple of those can cost you the value of this car. Now that they're on the used car market, they're literally in many cases not even worth fixing. Unfortunately, there's many other cases. Coolant leaks, classic BMW symptoms. Coolant and white spots speckled throughout the engine compartment quite often means you may have a water pump problem. You may in fact have cooling line issues. You may have had thermostat or radiator problems. Those all contribute to early demise if they're not looked after. And engines like this are high strung and generally will not last if neglected or abused. On top of it, down at the bottom of the engine, they have the rod bearings, your reciprocating mass. So your crankshaft connects to the rod, connects to the piston, and unfortunately the rod to the crankshaft interface, there's a set of bearings. Those bearings generally wipe after 40, 50, 60,000 miles. After that time, you're pretty much either throwing the engine away, or if you get to it soon enough and you draw an oil sample and you're able to verify that there's trace elements of that certain types of metals, but you caught it on time, you might be able to save the engine. But if you run it too long, you run at 70, 80,000 miles, it's been run hard, you're using the wrong oil, and possibly you're cold starting it and revving it up, you're guaranteed to wipe out those bearings and take out the crank. If you wipe out that crankshaft in a modern day engine like this V10 by BMW, almost surefire you're going to be spending thousands of dollars replacing and repairing that crank, or just replacing that engine in its entirety. Very expensive parts. SMG pumps, because a lot of these now have, of course, an SMG gearbox. That's a common failure point. Those engines won't last, but that's more of a transmission issue. The engine itself is extremely fragile. While it revs nice, it's glorious, it's one of the best sounding engines on the market, it simply will not last. And keeping these with low mileage on them ultimately is the best way. Take them out as a Sunday cruiser and put them away. Keep them well maintained and observe your oil quality, because as soon as you start seeing some of those softer metals and coppers and particulate in the engine oil, that surefire means you're probably about to embark on a major engine job. Another popular engine size, we'll give you a list here shortly, but let's start out with a vehicle like Ram. Of course, they've been building V8 engines, and Dodge and Ram trucks have been putting out engines for many years. And while many would argue that these are some of the best engines, a lot of these, especially with the Hemi and some of these later generation 4.7s, 5.7s, develop what they call a Hemi tick. They have poor oiling to get to the top end of the engine, and excessive amount of idling means you quickly develop a tick, 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 tick noise on top. Now, that being said, it's generally not a catastrophic failure, but many of these engines start developing weird noises and strange activities and even poor running conditions in as little as 60 to 70,000 miles. Now, while these can last a lot of miles, there's a lot of engines out there, including many from Audi, BMW, and Mercedes, with V8 engines that clearly will not last. Let's get into that list of some of the worst V8s. Well, let's talk about it, because it's not quite so amazing in this particular generation of a BMW. The engine you find in this vehicle obviously isn't more than enough to get it going along. Obviously BMW and the traditional trademark grills as well as those angel eyes make this car very desirable in a lot of circles. Unfortunately, the engine that you find when you're associating it with the X5 50i is where you have some of the issues, because when we're talking about that, that generally means engines that are identified within the 2008 to 2012 model years that have that 50i designation and don't begin and end with just the X5. You can also find them in 5 Series and 7 Series cars, and that is the wonderful BMW N63, one of the early generations. Now, they have gotten a lot better, but this first generation of that V8 is absolutely breathtakingly ruthless. And why is that, and what's actually going on with that type of engine? Let me explain. First of all, we won't even talk about that generation of vehicle anyway, with some of the other problems with electrics, air ride suspension that drops because the airbags start to let air out. Most of the issues are related to that engine. When we're talking about the 50 series, it's that hot V, because it's a V8. In the channel, they've decided to put 2 turbos in there, and those 2 turbos generate a lot of heat because exhaust temperatures make excessive heat. It gets glowing hot, and that glowing hot heat actually starts to melt out parts within that V of the engine. Of course, it takes a toll on gaskets, so you get leaks, both coolant, oil leaks, wiring, plastics, all of the other parts. Great, some of that's cosmetic, some of it's coolant leaks. Of course, you do get coolant leaks because that's one of the problems, water pumps, thermostats. The other issue is because those leaks, you end up with a situation that results in excessive oil consumption, because you end up with the valve guide seals that guide the valves and keep the oil below the engine. Those start to melt too, unfortunately, because of all that exhaust temp heat, and then you wind up eating lots of oil. These are oil eater 9000s, unfortunately. So then you have a heavy oil consumption, coupled with the fact that BMW said BMW Care, they were going to try to take care of some of the customers. Allegedly, that was really just moving people along to try to coach them and basically say, hey, look, we'll try to take care of it as best we can. It does ultimately often mean new rebuilds or engine top ends, but there's a lot of problems with that. There's also excessive battery draw, just has to do with that vehicle in general. But related to the engine, you do also have other big issues. For example, fuel injectors. They say leaking injectors are one of the big problems here with that engine as well. And because of that, what ends up happening, the fuel winds up going down into the cylinders, leaking down. It doesn't necessarily leak externally, it leaks internally, and then you wind up with washing of the cylinders. If you wash your cylinders, that takes away the oil film. No oil film, move that cylinder, it starts to scratch the internals. You get the rest, right? So the engine becomes toast in a very short period of time if you end up losing injectors. Another big issue is the timing chains. Timing chains on these vehicles, that keeps the pistons and the valves in synchronization, so you bring in fuel, exhaust, and spark and all that good stuff. If that synchronization goes out of whack, you basically can wind up with piston and valve connection and catastrophic boom, and then your engine's toast again. So that's another big issue, because those timing chains would stretch, or sometimes the ramps would break and let go, and then you'd skip a cog. So clearly it was a bad design right from the get-go. I guess fundamentally it was a great design. In practice and execution, not so much. The next dumpster fire engine that wouldn't make it up to 50,000 miles without doing some major intervention is what's behind or under the hood of a vehicle like this. Well, what exactly are we looking at here? Well, clearly a big domestic boat. But what is it? Well, this is the Palm Springs Special, as you can tell. Yeah, because it's a Cadillac, and look at all the quality control on that plastic trim. Big, beautiful headlights. But back in 2006 is where things really went wrong for this brand. Yeah, they wanted to use that big, powerful V8 engine. Yeah, they've got some great touches. No sunroof on this tank, but they do have the chrome rims, which again is great for Palm Springs. Here, big, beautiful taillights, and you got a set of quad exhaust tips. And what we're talking about here is the V8 North Star engine. What we're looking at here is a DHS, but realistically, DTS is what we're talking about here. So many problems. Where should we start? And where do we end? I could talk about this all day, but actually, let's take it from the top. You can get valve cover, gasket seal leaks, carbon buildup in the engine, which is easy to fix. You just got to do some low-cost maintenance, but it's a problem. Compression was also altered because of some of that carbon buildup, but piston rings here as well were a common failure point and led to massive oil consumption. So you actually had heavy oil, carbon buildup, leaking coolant. Water pumps would fail. The rear main seal that goes out to the drive to the transmission would known to leak as well, so you'd wind up with a puddle of oil underneath. And this thing leaked consumed burned oil, coolant every which way from inside out. Part of that was also because the infamous valve cover gasket. You'd blow a valve cover and then you'd essentially internally start eating some coolant. That's a bad scene because you start gobbling up coolant, you misfire, you also introduce moisture into the combustion chamber, which is never good, and you wind up with black exhaust smoke coming out the tailpipe. It wasn't also uncommon to experience oil pump, and hey, if your oil pump lets go, you don't put oil into the engine where you need it, and then you basically go boom! Also, water pumps were notorious for these vehicles, so not only did you leak coolant externally or through the blown heads, but you also had water pumps that often would give up the ghost. So it was just a poorly built engine. Nobody who ever owned one of those Cadillac engines ever was very satisfied with it, and they guaranteed did not last over 50,000 miles. And here's one that really pains me to talk about this way because it is such a magnificent vehicle to drive, and it's this car in front of me here, and it actually carries an engine that's ruthlessly unreliable, actually to the point where you probably won't get 40, 50,000 miles, at least not without doing some major engine work. And when I mean major, if you have to tear apart the bottom and change out rod bearings and potentially connecting rods, that's pretty major, I would say. That usually means pulling subframe, dropping a whole bunch of hardware, suspension parts, bottom end, and getting a real expert mechanic to actually repair that for you. But what is this and the kind of car we're talking about? Well, there's really only one type of car that engine carried in, and in this BMW world. But let's take a look. Of course, you do have the angel eyes with the traditional kidney grills, but look, snarling nostrils. This here is a specific 3 Series car, but what kind? Yeah, you do have the aggressive front spoiler, beautiful wheels in BMW's fashion. Look, it's an M3. And look, beautiful mirror. Of course, they have that cool little brake right there. And this one here is a convertible. As you can see, it splits into multiple pieces. The interior is quite attractive and it wears very, very well. That's one thing BMW does well. Of course, one touch access in, circle around, and of course this is the generational taillights from that time. You do have a set of quad tips. It's a gorgeous car in many, many ways. This particular one is in convertible format, but you can also get this in a sedan. It's from a generation when they didn't have M4s and they didn't call an M4 a 2-door. This was either in a 2-door or 4-door version. You could get the E90, E92, and the engine that we're talking about is the S65, right? The S65, which is a smaller version of the S85, which the infamous F1 derived V10 engine from the M5 in the same generation. But this engine, lots of problems. Water pumps, thermostats, it eats that. Water cooling lines everywhere. This will lose oil, this will lose coolant, and more importantly, this will eat rod bearings. After 40, 50,000, 60,000 miles is a stretch, and you're having to tear into it to actually make sure you replace them on time, because these are catastrophic time bombs. We also can't forget about the throttle actuators. When they go bing, check engine light, limp mode, and there's a whole host of other knickknacks and tallywhacks in there that cause this thing a problem. So sadly, the S65 by BMW, beautiful car, sad display of failureship. Next junk engine is the Eagle Hemi 8, as you find here in the Chrysler 300, parked right behind me here. Now, a lot of people love these cars. They're great. Well, are they? Really, these are nothing more or less than the rental special, or those gray-haired dudes cruising around in Palm Springs. Or maybe those bleached-haired hot tub salesmen like to drive around in these as well. But let's talk about these. If I were to sit my 5-year-old kid down to actually draw a picture of a car, they'd probably draw something that looks similar to this. It looks very generic, boxy, square, lacking in style and elegance. The only thing they did here was add this impressive little grille. Like you see right here, that is certainly unique. Other than that, there's not much to look at. The outside is fairly boxy and not much going on there but the rent. Of course, at the back, you have these crazy little taillights by Chrysler. Yes, there's a sunroof. You get some of your fun and frivolity, and there's some cheesy chrome all the way around. But inside, you have the Tupperware Special. Nothing more, nothing less with the quality of plastics and fit and finish. They don't even make Fisher-Price get jealous over that. But it's not just about that. It's about the 5.7-liter V8 engine tucked under that hood called the Eagle, and it's not great. Sure, while they're not huge bucks to fix, and if you constantly pour money in them and you made dozens of trips to your local dealer, you could probably stay ahead of some of the engine issues. But there are a lot of engine issues which potentially put this thing out of service and would essentially yield a 300 with the 5.7 trash right from the get-go.
What kind of issues could you get?
Well, the exhaust manifold bolts coming off the engine would break or snap off or get loose. They'd rust out, and that was a problem. You start getting that almost like the engine is spitting. That's a sure sign that you've got an exhaust leak. Another issue with the poor design and the poor heating system that they actually installed in these vehicles, there's a propensity to actually overheat. Very common with a lot of these cars. Get stuck in that Palm Springs desert, guaranteed you're going to start to overheat and bubble this thing over. Poorly designed. Check engine lights is another thing you'll find. Misfires. And the roller lifters are problematic as well. If you start hearing ticking noises, that could be either from that, or could be piston slap, or it could be a variety of different engine failures. Then there's the multiple displacement technology that these cars incorporate as well, where they can switch cylinders on and off. Everybody knows GM and the 5.3, 6.2 liter engines struggle with that reliability when they use that system. Well, the same thing tends to apply with the Dodge products like this. Of course, they tried to incorporate other technology, variable cam timing systems, and that was problematic on a lot of these engines as well. There's just too much technology buried in this vehicle. It's not well built, not well designed, quite frankly, is a recipe for engine disaster. And literally being probably 1 in 30 of these is going to see some significant engine failures. This one is clearly one for the dumpster. If your budget can afford it, how about an LS500? Lots of power, V8 engine, and much, much more reliable. Now, the first one is one that we keep mentioning over and over again, but unfortunately qualifies as both some of the worst engines as well as some of the most oil-burning engines and some of the worst V8 engines on the market, and it's the wonderful BMW N63 engine like you find packaged in this beautiful machine here. Here we have a 750i. Now, you're going to find the N63 typically in anything with the 50 designation, such as 550, 650, 750, as well as any of the X5, X6 models 50i, but people buy them because they put down the numbers. Ultimately, they're a performance engine that actually outpaces a lot of the previous generation M5s. That's why they continually sell. But let's take a look at one of the examples of a vehicle that you'll find these in. And here's the 750. We've talked about this one before. Of course, we'll notice we have some great design themes. Most BMWs are all about the style and form follows function, but here, big grills, the big mouth sausage grill right there. You'll see awesome headlights. That's BMW's later style LEDs. And they have a pretty interesting front chin, great wheels. And again, we speak of these mirrors, and BMW never forgets the details. It's all in the details. And as well, more details right there with soft touch. And a large sunroof. And an oversized gas filler. How about cycling around the back? What about the LED taillights? And it's a 750, as I mentioned. So it has the 4.4 liter twin turbo V8, and it happens to be X-Drive, so it's good in the snow. You'll see carboned up rear tailpipes there, as well as on this side as well. And then if you cycle back here, you'll notice it actually has a pretty beefy stance. Sitting in this beautiful Q-stitch chairs makes you feel like a rock star. But unfortunately, if you don't have a rock star's payroll, you probably shouldn't be buying one of these. They guzzle oil like they're going out of style, primarily because they are a V8 engine. And as I mentioned before, and there's turbos in this V8 engine. They're packaged within the V, and it's called the hot V. And what that does is makes all kinds of heat where you don't want it at the top of the engine, and starts to heat soak the heads, which then translates into melting valve guides and valve guide seals, which then of course starts slurping oil up through the valve guides into the heads, consumes the oil and shoots it out the tailpipe. On top of that, you have accelerated battery deterioration because of all the technology. A big one is timing chain rattle and potentially timing chain failure, and you wind up throwing in the towel, and these cars never make huge miles. So the next problematic engine is what's unfortunately tucked under the hood of this beautiful Audi parked behind me. And that is actually a molding process in the factory created an issue where there could be cracks in the bore of the cylinder. If that happens, there could be leaking oil, could have combustion issues and running rough and tough idle, or it could potentially lead to a fire as a worst case scenario. Now, there's not a lot of these vehicles involved, but they are of significance and they're high dollar vehicles. So those who are buying these vehicles definitely want to know. And it's essentially any vehicle that's producing over 600 horsepower in the Volkswagen Audi group. For example, what we have here is the RSQ8. Beautiful twin turbo V8, 600 ponies, absolutely magnificent. And if you look really closely at this, with the wonderful headlights, of course it is Audi style, and those oversized wheels, what we have there are 23-inch tires, massive tires, oversized carbon ceramic brakes. Look at that slope. Does this all start to look very familiar? How about the vents on the back and those massively oversized tailpipes on both sides? And of course, Audi's trademark light signature. This actually involves not just the RSQ8 like we see here, also the RS6 Avant, and it also includes the Porsche Cayenne twin turbo and the Lamborghini Urus. If they fall within that certain time frame, they are potentially suspect and have been identified in NHTSA as one of the problem vehicles. So the next vehicle on my list is this little beauty behind me that likely won't last very long, and there is a V8 engine in there, and it is a 5-liter supercharged V8. And there is lots of problems, but let's talk about it. Before we get into the troubles, let's take a quick look. And you'll notice you've got the oversized red calipers, great accents. And how about that wonderful mirror? Keyless entry, both front and back, and oversized glass panel on the roof. How about that overhang though? That looks stout, love it. How about these wonderful tail lights? Absolutely gorgeous on this Sport. And as I said, it's supercharged and it's a 5-liter V8 engine. 1, 2 tailpipes, and they carbon up. You'll notice lots of carbon on a used vehicle. But the looks of this is absolutely beautiful and mesmerizing. Look at those rocker panels flare out all the way up to leading to this wonderful hood and this overall handsome stance that you find with the Range Rover Sport. You'll notice typical grille, Range Rover by Land Rover. And it's got some great headlights on there. And the front end is finished nicely, sculpted, beautiful. I don't think you'll find a nicer interior than in the Range Rover products anywhere. When these vehicles are new, they're absolutely beautiful. They're exceptionally powerful. They're wonderful. They sound great. And you're sitting like a king in the lap of luxury behind that wheel. But outside of the issues that you find with clunking noises in the front end and grinding noises from the electric brake or potential leaks, because it's a direct injected engine, it's very high tech. Outputs a lot of power, 550 horsepower to be precise, out of 5-liter V8. That's about 110 horsepower per liter. It's making a lot of power, but that comes at a cost. If you can afford to maintain these, yes, they'll go a long distance. The problem is, a lot of people can't, and they just get very, very expensive to maintain. Not specifically this one, but the older generation, previous, actually had a timing chain TSB. There was an issue where timing chains break, come apart, and of course, interference engine means catastrophic engine failure. These newer ones, I've heard of a few cases with the timing chains breaking, but also the supercharger that's smacked on top has a snorkel that is known to come loose and make a lot of noise, eventually requiring a significant repair. Of course, there's carbon fouling as it's direct injected, so that means long-term maintenance there as well as excessive carbon at the tailpipe. And now that this engine's been out a little while, they're starting to find more and more leaks from coolant reservoirs, radiators, and other hoses and fittings. All this technology and performance crammed under that beautiful hood right there means that it's guaranteed you're going to spend a lot of money keeping this car on the road. Do you think you can get 200,000 miles out of these? I seriously doubt it. So another great one for you, and it was wrapped up in 2018, but what it affects is 2012 to 2014 Range Rover Sport, similar to what we have behind us here, and the LR4 models. And when you drive a Range Rover like these, you expect perfection, you expect luxury, and you expect quality. For the most part, those are all there. Unfortunately, there are some problems. And it's the 5-liter supercharged V8 engine that's the questionable piece within this conversation. Now, obviously, looking at these are very, very attractive, sporty, quick, luxurious. What's not to like about a Range Rover Sport? Other than the fact that the air ride goes, front suspension problems, carbon fouling, electrics in the windows, electric e-brake hanging up and causing squealing noises. Besides those things, what could possibly be wrong here? Well, what it is the timing chain and the timing chain tensioners, levers, are all potentially at risk. Most manufacturers would suggest they're good for at least 150,000 miles, but unfortunately, many customers have experienced outright failures. And when something gives away on your timing system, the chain maybe breaks or your tensioner slacks up, what you can have is a piston running into a valve. When that happens, that's a shock wave. Broken pistons, valves, you could potentially fracture the crankshaft, camshaft. You can have a lot of different problems, and some of the fixes were as little as $5,000 all the way up to 20 grand for a full engine replacement, if that's what it took. What some of the settlement includes is a new warranty, 4-year, 50,000 mile minimum to cover and give you protection for that. And then they actually prorate it. So every year after that, they give you 70%, 60%, 50%, 40%. So they actually start prorating it year on year on year. So there's always some level of protection that's slightly reduced in value. But at the end of the day, they were forced to ante up because the owner's manual didn't advise people. And sadly, 150,000 miles for timing chain? No,
People were lucky to see if they got half of that. The next beast of burden with some of the worst engines is the Nissan Endurance 5.6 liter V8, as you'll find in this vehicle, the Titan or the Titan XD. And they're very attractive. They've come a long way, and no one ever saw Nissan coming with a full-size pickup, but this is actually a very nice contender. However, that 5.6 is a problem. But let's take a look first. Oh, look at those beautiful headlights. And the big strong grille, almost in line with what you're finding in the Nissan and Infiniti lineup. But here embossed, you'll see a Titan logo on there on the chrome. Very difficult to see. But you've got these great little hooks on the front. How about this great little two-tone trim along all the way down? No sunroof on this rig, but it's still a very, very pretty truck all the way down the line. Of course, you've got a power rear slider. And I love these rear tail lights as well. Here we have a Platinum Reserve by Nissan, and it can haul a pile of weight too. You'll notice dual exhaust tips. Actually, very nicely equipped and nicely finished, with a stepped up level of texturing in the leather seats and some great technology packed abound. What's the problem with that 5.6 liter V8 called the Endurance? Well, there's a few things. Number one, fuel pumps have been known to go out. When they do or they run lean, they're known to take out the catalytic converter with it. They burn out, that's a huge expense. Sadly, some of these engines are known to overheat. It's happening in quite a few situations, quite a few cases. Check the net. But the big one, of course, is the timing chain failures that they're seeing with these. They break, and then there goes the engine. Huge expense once you lose your timing chain. I mean, after all, that's your piston and valve alignment, right? There's also some other electrical gremlins. These vehicles aren't all that well sorted out, and certainly isn't quite as robust as what you're finding in the Toyota Tundra. Either way, due to the level of failures and the catastrophes that these vehicles see, I don't see them packing on a huge amount of miles like the old classic Chevy 350. And there's the next one. You won't make 100,000 miles. I dare you to try to prove me wrong and show me some classified ads with vehicles with more than 100,000. Let's take a quick look, and what are we talking about here? Well, it's a Land Rover product, no surprise, and it's a Range Rover. I mean, sure, they've got the big glorious wheels, single touch access in, and of course, they always have these glorified looking aftermarket style taillights, and sadly, only royalty can actually afford to keep these outside of warranty. Let's take a look inside. Absolutely glorious inside, very comfortable, but it's the electronics here that'll bite you in the rump. The infotainment system will die, and it'll force you back to the dealer to get that rectified, and that's a frequent occasion. And so electrics are a big part of the problem. Another part of the problem, suspension issues, as you can look right here. Not a big shocker. Here, let me demonstrate here for you. As you can see, it's leaning a little bit. Why is it leaning? Well, if you look at the back here, this rear end is a little higher than this rear end. Take a look. This is sitting down on its rump, and that's because the air ride suspension that these vehicles are equipped with will let you down, and when they do, it settles down. And catastrophically failing, causing you thousands of dollars to rectify the problem. We also don't want to forget leaks. Yes, there's a sunroof underneath all that snow, common failure for leaks. And under the bonnet there, well, coolant leaks. Lots of issues with coolant left on the ground, whether it's some of the plastic pipes, water pumps, thermostats. As well, you can expect problems with the fuel pump and or the high pressure fuel injection system. So sadly, as glorious as these are to drive around in, they're not so glorious outside of warranty, because you will be paying the piper through and through again. And right there is a good old-fashioned GMC or Chevy pickup truck. Remember back in the day, the old 350 small block? That thing was a workhorse. Even the 302s weren't bad either. But then they started experimenting. 6.2s, we had 6 liters, we also had the 5.3, and now we're into the 5.3 liter EcoTech 3 is where the real problem is. And let's talk about it. I mean, trucks are very hard to come by these days. Why? Because they're popular. You can drive around in bad weather, you can go off-roading with them, you could certainly haul a lot of weight, you can also do your little construction projects, and a lot of them now are equipped to be very comfortable inside. Of course, you got the great big headlights and little fog lights here, and all kinds of different accents in the front. Trucks have come a long way. Of course, we have a strong hood on the front, and we have this great flare here. You'll notice it's all-terrain in this particular model with chrome accents here and there. And the interior are quite comfortable on these as well. Now we can get leather, sunroof, and the whole 9 yards. So what can possibly go wrong with a good old tried and true Chevy? Well, it's, again, as I say, it's that 5.3 EcoTech 3. Here's some examples of some problem areas. It's that directed injected engine which causes all kinds of carbon buildup, and that leads to a whole barrage of issues. We can get fuel injector failure. Of course, that's always pricey on any direct injected engine, as well as the four-wheel drive transfer case fails on these. Quite a frequent occurrence, unfortunately. It is in the top 5 of failure issues. And then the fuel level sensor is also a problem area. How do you like to be driving along on your long trip thinking you have a half tank of fuel left and all of a sudden, boom, you have none? Well, that is a problem, and they're a bit of a pain to. And of course, the active fuel management is also a commonly known issue, cycling in and out, huge problem. These engines just do not last. So as good as history is with the old GMs, the 5.3 Ecotec 3 is not one to last a long time. And we have from 1997 to 2010, you have a V8 engine here. And this V8 engine is actually 5.4 liter by varied displacement. As you can see right here, this is the Triton V8. That is one of the worst engines in Ford's history. It has a 3-valve configuration on this engine and has been a problem that's not repairable. And these engines just keep going on, failure after failure, and you have to replace engines or rebuild them to the tune of $7,000 or $8,000 every single time, and you can never make it right. All you can do is fix it, wait it out, and you'll fix it again. And these engines, you can expect problems, for example, like blocked oil passages that can actually negatively impact your phase problems, which is your cam phasers, and that affects your timing. Without that, you don't have an engine running properly. And just Google cam phasers. There's no shortage of commentary on there. Lots of DIYers at home. But at the end of the day, it's these Fords. For example, the F-150, 250, Excursion, and Expedition that share these garbage engines from 97 to 2010 way too long, and just means that you just better steer away from this heartbreak drivetrain. General Motors screwed almost 1 million truck owners. The latest news on top of all the other news with bad transmissions, and we heard about the lifter issues, people dealing with all kinds of recalls that have kept their trucks in the dealership, and the reputation is taking a hit. And that's the worst part. It's not just the fact that you have to take your truck in, it's the fact that even though with a 4.3% increase in sales, but that does leave the buyers with the question, can I trust General Motors? Chevy and General Motors have had a spectacular year selling trucks this year, and they're tied up there with Ford. They've had spectacular sales results, and they continue selling these vehicles. Now, unfortunately, the latest recall could in fact put them on their heels. When we're looking at vehicles like the Chevy Silverado, the GMC like this, and the Sierra, they're great looking trucks, they're beautiful, they have all of the great technology, and they become one of the most popular sellers in the full-size lineup. I mean, with people now electing not to buy the Rams because of the high prices and the quality issues, and now you can only get a 6-cylinder engine in a lot of the Ram products. On top of it, Ford is selling a lot of trucks as well, but GMC and Chevy have been top pops and selling a lot of full-size trucks. As again, Silverados and Sierras, Tahoes, Yukons, and even Suburbans are selling great numbers. A lot of these vehicles now that come equipped with the L87 V8 engine under the hood means that they could be risked a significant failure. There's been at least 58 complaints now with that specific engine, the L87, where they allege that they've had absolute catastrophic engine failures. Driving down the road, minding their own business, all of a sudden the vehicle clunk, 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 or just stops completely. Now, where a lot of people get scared about this isn't just that the engine breaks and then they have to take it to the dealer, and the dealer may potentially replace the engine, which they are on the hook for, by the way, at least if it's recognized under warranty or the NHTSA. A lot of people are worried about driving down the road like this, and all of a sudden the engine stops, and then naturally there's a risk for collision. General Motors has had significant issues with recalls, bad transmissions, bad engines in some cases, with the 5.3s, the 6.2s having to do lifter and rocker problems with those vehicles, a lot of electronics, and we know even like the Blazer and the Blazer EV, some of the interfaces had to go back for reprogramming. There was actually a period of time last year where they had to halt production because of significant issues with the programming and the design of a lot of their infotainment programming and the additional electronics mounted on board. So big question is, why does this stuff keep happening? Why do they constantly see more transmission problems, more engine problems coming out of General Motors as well? Not only limited to these, Ford's had more than their share. They're certainly leading the recall, and they're known as the recall kings. The same with Stellantis and the Rams. None of these products have particularly good quality, and it's been that way a long time. While Toyota and the Tundra has had problems with the engines and their new V6s, the bottom line is that's a relatively small blip on the radar. These problems have existed with these 3 big domestic product manufacturers, GM, Chevy,
Ford, Ram, or Dodge have all had problems for years. But why is this happening? We let it happen. And see, a lot of the problem goes back to the chicken tax, which was derived by governments years ago to prevent foreign vehicles from coming in and horning in on the business. The reliability of a lot of those products were potentially better, but by creating the chicken tax many years ago, it put these vehicles in a position where they had a much more advantageous time. They were able to sell vehicles much more competitively within the big three, and it kept a lot of the outside manufacturers that were great strict competition outside of the game. It was not cost competitive for them to try to compete. These manufacturers by Chevy, GM, Ford, Ram were all doing their own thing, all creating comparable products, and we just got used to buying vehicles that didn't have the quality and the durability and reliability that we all love. Well, they're big heavy-duty trucks built on big sturdy platforms, and they'll do heavy work. Their attribute is not reliability necessarily. Yeah, they'll bang around, they'll clunk around, they'll make noise, and they'll run a long time. The overall reliability is not getting any better. Now with modern day engines, of course, GM now we're getting into some of these more technical engines, more electronics. It's just a recipe for disaster. And a lot of these vehicles are just a module away from catastrophic failure. On top of it, these engines now too rush through the market, and of course with the UAW strikes that we've seen in the last couple years, that puts a lot of the workers building these vehicles in a position where they're not loving it. And especially when there was during that strike a couple years back, there was a lot of workers that just weren't in a good state of mind, likely, and a lot of these vehicles probably weren't put together with the most love, care, and attention. A lot of it unfortunately does come from the top, and the OEMs and the management is trying to push these products through as quick as possible, get these out to the field. And let's face it, during 2000, when there was that shortage of chips, many people commented that the overall quality of vehicles went down. Insiders are even saying over at Ford that Ford's putting 2,400 less parts within their new trucks in 25 than they did the year before. In other words, they're reducing the number of single components and creating more of modularity. Everything's for the sake of cutting costs. And that's just where we're at. We're in a time now where they're looking for efficiency. They're looking to cut costs, and it's starting to show. It's starting to rear its ugly face. Why are we seeing so many failures? Because there's more cost cutting, in my own personal opinion. Remember years ago when GM introduced glue to hold on their doors? Everybody laughed about it, but that was another example. If they could save 6 bolts, 8 bolts to bolt a door onto the chassis and use glue instead, they would save even $1, $2 per vehicle. Multiply that by millions of vehicles, that's a ton of money. And General Motors, Chevy, GM, they realized early that there's little nuances, there's little efficiencies they can gain, and by doing that, they can save a ton of money. Some of these cost savings are starting to catch up, starting to creep in there, and now we're starting to see what the results are. The worst part is customers coming out of the dealing with those 5.3s and 6.2s with the rocker problems, now all these transmission issues that they've had. On top of it, now the latest is 887,000 engines are potentially going to need replacement or investigation because of potential rod bearing failures. That's right, catastrophic engine failures to the bottom end means that a lot of customers are going to have to take their vehicles in for assessment and possible engine replacements. Yukons, Tahoes, Cadillacs, and as well Chevy Silverado and the GMC Sierra products like we're looking at right here. From 2019 to 2024, pretty much inclusively, if you have one of those vehicles with that style of engine, there's a high probability if you're driving that gas engine with the L87 that you may be at a significant risk of one of those engines catastrophically failing on you. Now, while this may not seem like a significant problem, the issues is it keeps mounting and mounting and mounting. If it's not one issue, it's another, it's another. And this takes more than an impact on your wallet or a time at the dealership. This is taking a significant toll on the reputation of the brand, a brand that you could rely on for being a rugged, durable workhorse pickup truck. And now on top of it, a lot of customers are having to take their vehicles in, take time off work, and deal with that accordingly. Now, while GM may or may not replace the engine in most cases, allegedly NHTSA, if they get their hands on it, the dealerships and the OEM will have to replace these engines. The fact remains is if you have one of those vehicles, you could in fact be dealing with a whole pile of issues. The worst part is, with the reputation and durability of a lot of these manufacturers, where can you go these days? If you can't go for a reliable V8 that's dealing with bad transmissions, rod bearings, lifter problems, and all kinds of electrical issues, Where else do you go? Toyota? Well, the Tundra's got their twin turbo V6 that's got catastrophic engine issues too, and they're under a current recall of over 100,000 units to replace. Ford's got issues with EcoBoost engines, and Ram is moving into this brand new turbocharged Hurricane engine that we don't yet know what the quality's like and the durability long term, as it's just came out this year. The full-size truck market does not leave us in a state of mass confidence. Every single brand seems to be struggling with challenges where there's durability, catastrophic failures, and everything is extremely high priced. It means that customers are getting screwed every which way they go, and sadly it all leaves us in a lurch. Where do we go, and how badly do these truck owners get screwed? And with all of that said, be sure to check out those mega compilations, some of the most reliable vehicles you can find. It's the mega list. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. We'll see you all real soon, everybody. Bye-bye.